Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto discover a mask during wave mission. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. The world is changing. All that once was, now is forgotten, for there are none who live who can remember. It began with the forging of the great rings. 3 for the elven lords, immortal and undying. 7 for the dwarf lords, great miners and craftsmen. 9 rings gifted to the kings of men, who above all else, desire power. For within these rings lie the powers to govern Middle-earth. But they had all of them been deceived, for another ring was made. In the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring, in which he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life on Middle-earth. One ring to rule them all. One by one, the free peoples of Middle-earth fell to the power of the ring. But there were some who fought back. A last alliance of men and elves, determined to break the power of the ring. And on the slopes of Mount Doom, they fought to determine the fate of Middle-earth. In that final battle, it seemed that good had triumphed. But the power of the ring would not be undone. Sauron himself entered the fray, and his power could not be stopped. With one blow of his massive mace, he slew the king of men quicker than anyone could react. It was then that Isildur, son of the king, took up his father's blade and cut the ring from the hand of Sauron himself. And without the ring, for which his soul was permanently bound, Sauron spontaneously combusted with the force to make all 3 armies fall to their knees. And so it was that Sauron, enemy of the free peoples of Middle-earth, was defeated. And the ring passed into Isildur's hand, and he had the one chance to destroy evil forever. But the hearts of men are easily corrupted. Isildur kept the ring, and in his greatest need, the ring betrayed him to his death. And there it lay, for centuries in the bottom of a river, until it ensnared a new bearer. The ring came to the creature Gollum, and for 500 years it poisoned his mind. And there it lay in wait, until it heard the whispers. Rumors of a shadow in the lands of darkness, a nameless evil. And the ring knew its time had come. It abandoned Gollum, but fate had something different in mind for the ring. It was picked up by the most unlikely creature to ever do so. Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit from the Shire. And once again, the ring lay in wait. Eventually, the ring passed into the hands of Frodo Baggins, nephew of Bilbo. And Frodo, with the help of Gandalf the Grey, set out on a quest to cast the ring back into the fires from whence it came, and destroy evil for all eternity. And Frodo did just that. But some evils managed to escape that day, for while the Nazgul, the Dark Riders who searched for the ring endlessly, were destroyed that day, a token of the Nazgul still survived. The mask of their leader, the Witch King of Angmar, reformed itself and lay in wait, on a shrine made in memory of the Nazgul, as it waited for another wielder. History became stories, stories became myths, and myths became legends. The tales of the so-called Lord of the Rings now serve as simply that. A tale to enchant and delight the children of the modern age. But the mask of the Witch King survived, and sat there, waiting with its store of dark power. And finally, the mask was found. After his battle with his friend-turned-enemy, Hashirama Senju had stumbled into a cave to heal and rest. And in that cave he found the shrine of the Nazgul, the dreaded ringwraiths. And on that shrine, he found the mask of the legendary Witch King himself. He could feel its power calling to him, but he knew that it was a dark power and it couldn't be trusted. He took the mask, but only to try and destroy it. To say that Hashirama failed miserably would be an understatement. Nothing he did, not even his strongest jutsu, could as much as scratch that mask. Finally, resigned that it couldn't be destroyed, he locked it away in another shrine in a dark forest in Konoha, with a warning left for whoever unsealed it to never put on the mask, or they would most likely die or become something terrible. The dark power of the mask began to corrupt the area around it, and the area of Training Ground 44 became henceforth known to the inhabitants of Konoha as the Forest of Death, for that very reason. Despite that warning that Hashirama left beside the mask, it was ignored, and one boy did unseal the mask. His name is Naruto Uzumaki, and this is the story of how one boy became a king. This is the tale of the new Witch King. Naruto lunged in front of the gigantic snake and quickly stabbed it right in the eye. The serpent shrieked in pain before dispelling in a cloud of smoke, revealing it to be a summon. Snake summons? He wondered aloud. Then it hit him. He grinned a fox-like grin. So, Orochi-chan is here, he said to himself. He had met the Sannin a while back, and while some would say that Tsunade was better looking, Orochimaru was good looking in her own strange, somewhat twisted way. So, that's snakes in the forest, huh? Kurama stated. Yep, might as well go say hi then. Naruto replied. The fox rolled his eyes. He didn't trust Orochimaru that much, but given a choice between Orochimaru or Danzo, he'd take Orochimaru. Of course, Naruto liked both of them. Danzo, cause he saw Naruto as actually a valuable asset to the Leaf and cause he actually trained him, unlike Naruto's supposed sensei. Orochimaru, do the math. Naruto jumped into the trees and followed the scent of snakes, easier with Kurama enhancing his senses, and landed on a branch to overlook the battle between the Sannin and the two genin of Naruto's team. Well, battle is a little too generous. Try more like slaughter. Orochimaru was simply toying with the two. Sakura was pretty much trying not to piss herself at the weight of Orochimaru's ki. Don't ask me to explain killing intent. I really can't. Just think of the spiritual pressure in Bleach. And was all in all being rather useless. Sasuke was trying, and failing, to hold off the Sannin with his two Tomoed Sharingan, which looked like it had just matured into that stage. Orochimaru licked her lips and smirked as she sensed Naruto's unique chakra signature. Always the punctual one Naruto-kun, she thought. Sasuke's eyes widened as Naruto landed in between the two. What's up, Teme? Naruto said, his eyes crimson with slitted pupils, his canines elongated, his whisker marks longer and more jagged than before. Sasuke shivered in fear. Naruto's eyes weren't like that of the goofball, Dobi, that he knew and remembered. They were more like that of a hunter, a killer, a creature with endless amounts of cruelty. Orochimaru grinned as she looked at the demonic blonde. Perfect timing, Naruto-kun, she said, licking her lips once again. Naruto, to which credit is due for his acting skills, grinned sadistically. And you are? He said mockingly. Orochimaru mentally rolled her eyes. She chuckled in a way that definitely sounded creepy to two of the genin. To Naruto, it just sounded kinda hot. I am Orochimaru of the Sannin, formerly of Konoha, she said in a prideful tone, dispelling the genjutsu on her forehead protector. The symbol for the grass village was instantly replaced by the music note symbol of sound. She darted forward, summoning a large brown snake as she went, and sent a barrage of kunai at the genin. Sannin, huh? You don't look so tough. Futon. Daitopa. Wind style. Great breakthrough. Naruto yelled as he expelled a gigantic blast of wind that sent the kunai scattering and dispelled the snake summon. He quickly flipped through his hand signs. Kaden. Hosenka no Jutsu. Fire style. Phoenix Sage fire technique, he bellowed as he sent a stream of fireballs that were about the size of a basketball each. Orochimaru quickly shunshined, body flicker, out of the path of destruction and pulled a katana out of the mouth of a serpent slithering from her sleeve. Shall we dance then, Naruto-kun? She said with a smile. Futon. Shinkyujin. Wind style. Vacuum blade, the genin thought. Naruto exhaled an amount of yellowish-green colored wind chakra onto his kunai blade, creating a saber of wind energy. Bring it, he said as his wind-enhanced kunai blade connected with the kusanagi blade in Orochimaru's hand. What nobody saw, however, was the wink that Naruto gave to the Sannin. Orochimaru fought the urge to snicker as she fought down a blush. Despite her attempts, a faint, barely noticeable tinge of pink appeared on her pale skin. Naruto cackled like a maniac. Hey Kurama, I'm gonna need some of your chakra to make this look a little more believable. You got it, kid. One medium-sized order of yokai, demonic chakra, coming right up. Kurama called back. Naruto grinned as his chakra levels skyrocketed, and his ki that was seemingly directed at the Sannin doubling in weight and potency. Orochimaru flinched and was a bit shocked. So, Kurama-kun is giving him some aid in the act? This could be a little more difficult than I anticipated, she thought. She smirked. She always loved a good fight. Naruto dashed back to avoid a strike from the kusanagi. He flashed through his hand signs. Orochimaru quickly realized what he was doing and she flipped through her own hand signs. Futon. Atsugai. Wind style. Pressure damage, Doden. Doryuheki. Earth style. Earth-style wall, Naruto inhaled and expelled a pressurized blast of air shaped like a tornado, while Orochimaru clapped her hands on the ground. Right before the blast hit the Sannin, a wall of earth quickly rose up to block the attack. Upon connection with the wall, the blast immediately exploded in a huge dome of blue wind chakra, vaporizing the wall and sending Orochimaru's somewhat shredded body flying. She hit the trunk of a tree with a sickening crunch, and lay still. Naruto inwardly gulped. He hoped he didn't overdo it. He had a tendency to go a bit overkill. "Ya think?" Kurama replied in response to his host's thoughts. "Is it over?" Sakura asked fearfully. Her only response was the corpse, sitting up and coughing violently. Orochimaru's mouth widened as an arm, followed by a torso, and finally legs were violently vomited out. Orochimaru stood, her shed skin dissolving into white liquid as she smoothed the greenish slime out of her hair. She laughed for a moment. "You surprised me, Naruto-kun. I wasn't expecting an B-ranked futon jutsu at your age," she said. Naruto grinned. "I'm only 16, is it such a surprise?" Orochimaru smirked. Inwardly, however, she was experiencing much different feelings. "Danzo," she thought to herself. "What the hell have you been teaching him while I've been gone? You said minor futon jutsus, like D or C ranked, not freaking B ranked jutsu," she mentally raged. Naruto pulled out 2 shurikens and flipped through his hand signs. "Futon. Shinkujin," he bellowed as he threw the small weapons at Orochimaru. The wind chakra formed over the shurikens, turning the small projectiles into basically a buzzsaw of wind. Orochimaru quickly ducked Matrix style to avoid the shurikens, and she almost missed seeing Naruto darting in with another Shinkujin applied to a kunai. "You're mine now," he yelled. Orochimaru smirked and slapped the kunai out of his hand and wrapped an arm around his neck. Sasuke had finally gotten over his shock and noticed that Naruto was held in a chokehold by the Sannin. What he didn't realize was that Orochimaru had bitten Naruto almost tenderly on the neck, forming a 3-pronged seal that vaguely resembled a 3-bladed shuriken on the side of his neck. A.N. Basically think of Itachi's Mangekyo Sharingan symbol on Naruto's neck. "Kukuku. Now Sasuke-kun, what will you do? Will you attack me and kill your teammate? Or try to save him? Make your choice, or I'll snap his neck." Orochimaru hissed. Sasuke swore angrily and began going through his options in his head. "Sorry Naruto," he thought. He quickly flipped through the hand signs from the jutsu he copied from Naruto during the fight by using his Sharingan. "Kaden. Hosenka no Jutsu," he bellowed before firing a swarm of fireballs at the pair. Orochimaru's eyes widened in shock that he would kill off his own teammate to kill her. Naruto was pissed off that, even though they weren't friends, Sasuke wouldn't hesitate to kill him if he was being used as a shield. So much for sensei's teachings. Orochimaru quickly began flipping through her hand signs. "Sorry Naruto-kun," she whispered as she gave him a quick peck on the cheek. "Futon. Daitopa," she yelled as she blasted Naruto out of the way with a burst of wind. Unfortunately, she overshot a bit and sent Naruto flying farther than she anticipated. She then fired a quick Suiden, water-style, jutsu to block the fireballs. She held up the tiger hand seal and extended her neck to inhuman lengths. She quickly sank her fangs on Sasuke's shoulder, leaving a mark shaped like 3 commas arranged in a circle. "He'll pay for making me harm Naruto-kun," she though angrily. She tossed the Uchiha at the pink-haired girl in disgust and jumped down onto the forest floor. She tasted the air with her tongue in a very serpentine manner and took off into the forest in the direction of Naruto's distinct ramen-flavored scent. "Hang on Naruto-kun," she said softly. "I'll find you." With Naruto. Naruto slammed through the tree, through a cabin, and finally through a random clothesline adorned with a pair of red polka-dotted underwear, barely getting tangled up in the line, and he just kept rolling. A.N. Points to anyone who gets the reference. Naruto yelled as he slammed through a boulder, a sickening crack resounding through the forest. Naruto proceeded to swear loudly in tones that would have made even a sailor blush. Somewhere in the village of Otto, Sound, a red-haired girl sneezed violently. "Some dumbass better not be talking about me," she yelled before being reprimanded by her teammate for her language, at which point she told him to go do something that is not anatomically possible for a human male. Naruto kept rolling for what felt like hours, it was only a few minutes, and finally fell into a cave. He coughed and tried to support himself on his right arm. He immediately let out a scream of agony. Apparently that crack was the sound of the bone in his forearms breaking clean through. Judging from the way his ankle felt, it was probably sprained. All from a B-ranked futon jutsu. Not that Naruto held it against Orochimaru anyways. It wasn't her fault. Given the speed of the attack, and the surprise that Sasuke had actually copied the jutsu, if Orochimaru hadn't acted then Naruto wouldn't have been alive to argue. It still hurt a lot, but he was alive. In retrospect, Naruto began to question the workings of the minds of Konoha residents. If his traitorous mule of a teammate was willing to kill him to strike down an enemy, he hated to see how things were going to end up in terms of teamwork. If that was what the village golden boy would do while the hated pariah would prefer to save his teammates, he hated to see how much further Konoha would go down the toilet. He groaned and began pulling himself shakily to his feet, ignoring the blood dripping on his face from the cut on his forehead. Naruto grit his teeth and pushed his bone back into place and waited for the fox to work his magic. "Kit, I take it we are in agreement to never do that again." Kurama yelled from the seal. "Do you have any idea how much yokai this is gonna take to heal your sorry ass? I mean, damn it, why did you just have to hit freaking everything that could have been lethal in this freaking forest?" Naruto groaned as reddish-orange chakra began seeping from his pores and slowly closing his wounds. "Would you just knock it off?" he growled, not bothering to think the sentence since they were alone. "If it weren't for Orochimaru-chan's jutsu, we would have been set on fire and probably wouldn't be arguing about this, now would we?" he asked rhetorically. Kurama proceeded to shut up, given he knew his host was technically right. Naruto tested his arm, and upon feeling no pain he carefully stood up. He glanced around the cave he was in. It almost resembled a temple, given the stone columns seemingly holding up the roof of the cave. Naruto's eyes flicked back and forth, the crimson irises fading back into sapphire blue. "Where are we?" he asked. Kurama pondered for a moment. "Kit, don't be alarmed, but I don't have a clue where we are." Naruto's sweat dropped and slapped his forehead. "You're real useful, aren't you?" he asked sarcastically. Kurama rolled his eyes. Yeah, laugh it up meat sack," the fox growled. Naruto shook his head and began walking down into the cave. He paused for a moment as he found himself in a large circular room. In the center was an empty pedestal adorned with ornate carvings of hooded figures on horses slaughtering enemies. One in particular had a strange helmet on, and was he riding a dragon? Naruto walked up to the pedestal and brushed some of the dust off of the surface. He raised an eyebrow at the intricate circular design carved into the rock. "Hey Fuzzball, any idea what this is?" "Two things. 1. Don't call me Fuzzball you stupid ninja, human. Second thing, yeah, I recognize it. That's a seal designed by the Shoden Hokage himself. It was designed to hold something that's usually about as strong as a biju." "So it's a Shiki Fuin then?" "Nope, this one's stronger than the one that was put on you that kept me stuck in your gut. My guess is, whatever Hashirama Baka sealed in that thing, it's really powerful." Naruto's eyes widened. There was a seal that existed for holding something stronger than a tailed beast? Naruto's face broke out into a wide grin. "Well then, let's fire that sucker up," he said as he wiped some blood off of his face. Kurama groaned again, but said nothing. Naruto smeared blood across the altar and channeled his chakra onto the carved stone. The intricate spirals and prongs glowed purple as the surface of the pedestal spiraled open like a camera lens. Rising up from a pool of purple energy was a helmet. And to the fox sealed within our hero, it reeked of power. It was simple in design. The mask-like helmet was forged of burnished steel, with a prong extending up from the forehead area and a crown of spikes jutting out from the scalp area on the helmet. It was a terrifying visage. It took Naruto a second, but he recognized it as the helmet on that dragon riding being on the carving. It was then that Naruto noticed the runes carved on the ground by the altar. "Damn, I can't read this," he muttered. "Hey Fox, can you read it?" Kurama rolled his eyes and nodded. "Here lies the leader of the Black Riders, the Lord of the Nazgul, the strongest of the 9, most ruthless of the Ringwraiths. Here lies all that remains of the Witch King of Angmar," Kurama translated. "Wow, the old orcish tongue. Haven't seen that in a few centuries," he commented. Which king of Angmar? Isn't that from that old children's tale, Lord of the Rings? Naruto asked. Yes, Baka. Don't you know that all stories and legends have some basis in the truth? I mean, I told you the myth about the Rikudo Sennin, Sage of Six Paths, and the Jubi, 10 Tails, didn't I? And we both know that those stories were true. Kurama deadpanned. Naruto took the helmet in his hands and lifted it off of the pedestal. He pondered for a moment before raising the helmet and beginning to lower it over his head. The minute the helmet mask was fixed to his head, the eyeholes began to glow an ominous purple. Ah shit, Kurama murmured right before Naruto's chakra levels skyrocketed. A visible storm of purple chakra swirled around Naruto before exploding into a pillar of that same malicious purple chakra. And throughout the entire process, Naruto let out a shrieking scream that was eerily similar to that of a wraith. With Orochimaru was running through the forest when she suddenly stopped. She twitched for a minute. That feeling. It's like I'm staring the Kyuubi no Kitsune, nine-tailed fox aka Kurama, right in the face. What is that malignant chakra? She thought to herself. Orochimaru glanced down and saw that her hand was shaking in fear. She grabbed her wrist and held up her arm. Am I trembling? Right at that moment a huge pillar of purple chakra shot straight into the sky. Orochimaru sank to her knees in shock and slight fear of the malevolent chakra she was feeling in the air. The thing was at least a few miles away, yet she felt as if the Jubi himself was leveling his ki at her. She tilted her head and heard a loud shriek like that of a wraith. She recognized that voice, screech or no. Naruto, she murmured. She flipped through her hand signs at a fast pace. Slithering snake mode, she hissed as her body from the waist down morphed into a black serpent tail. She immediately began slithering through the forest as fast as she could towards the pillar. Hang on Naruto, I'm coming for you, she hissed as she flicked her tongue out to taste the air. Outside Konoha, somewhere in the land of fire, Hidan was sitting on the ground sharpening the blades of his scythe when he felt a familiar chill. He only felt that chill whenever he was spoken to by his lord, Jashin. He sniffed the air and adjusted his grip on his tri-bladed scythe while fingering the pendant around his neck. It didn't look like much, just a black circle with an upside-down triangle inside the circle. Hidan nervously raised the rosary to his eye level and began praying silently. Jashin, what is this feeling of dread? Could it be that the one has returned? Hidan's only answer was a gigantic column of purple chakras shooting straight into the sky. Hidan stared in shock and he actually dropped his scythe. Oh, my, Jashin, that was his only response. His shock faded as a somewhat maniacal grin formed on his face. He raised his rosary again and let out a small prayer. Thank you for showing me the way. Now I know. Hidan opened his eyes and chuckled. The harbinger of Jashin has returned, he whispered. Hidan let the rosary fall back onto his unclothed chest as he picked up his scythe and sheathed it on his back. It's in Konoha, he observed. Hidan cracked his neck and set off as fast as he could, dropping a black cloak with red clouds on it as he ran. Screw the Akatsuki, religion takes priority over all. Forest of Death, Konoha? Sasuke was at that moment beating the snot out of a trio of Auto Genin. He grinned, the curse mark on his neck pulsing with power, as he grabbed the arms of one of them. Zabu? Zaku? Something like that. You seem awfully proud of those arms, Sasuke said with a sneer. Why don't we do something about that then? Sasuke began pulling on Zaku's arms, and not in a direction that they were meant to move in. Zaku screamed as Sasuke brutally broke the boy's arms, almost ripping them out of their sockets. Sasuke grinned wider and raised a foot to crush Zaku's skull when a distinct shriek pierced the air. Sasuke let go of the Auto Genin and screamed as the shriek seemingly began frying his mind. A trickle of blood ran out of one ear, betraying a ruptured eardrum on the Uchiha. Sasuke turned angrily to try and put his attacker in his place when he froze in shock. The figure was tall, at least 6 feet 3 inches, and looked very menacing. He was cloaked in black robes that fell over steel armor with spikes on various places, such as the shoulders, elbows, and the knuckles and fingers of the hands. Sheathed at his sides were a long dagger with a spiked guard, and a two-handed longsword just next to it. A steel helmet guarded the face, looking menacing with its crown of spikes jutting from the scalp, and the open-faced area of the helmet was empty and filled with shadows. But the eyes were the worst. Sasuke could see the blood-red eyes, with slitted pupils like that of an animal. Sasuke shook in unease. No, it was terror that Sasuke felt. The figure raised a gauntleted hand and closed its hand into a spiny fist except the index finger. The wraith waved its finger from left to right, in a tisk, tisk fashion. Sasuke's fear quickly melted into rage. How dare this peasant, this thing, attempt to order around him? An Uchiha? Know your place, Sasuke yelled as he flipped through his hand signs. Kaden. Hosenka no Jutsu. He bellowed as he sent a stream of fireballs at the wraith. The masked figure merely raised its gauntleted hand as its palm ignited in purple chakra. It waved its hand and formed a purple barrier in front of itself, blocking the fireballs. The fireballs hovered against the shield before being absorbed into the barrier. The wraith chuckled darkly as the barrier condensed into a small plate-sized circle. The barrier glowed and shot out the previously absorbed fireballs, the only difference being that they were larger and were now purple. Sasuke's Sharingan flared and he quickly rolled out of the way of the fireballs. Meanwhile, the wraith placed a hand on its longsword and drew it from its sheath, holding the blade in front of its face with both hands. The creature began slowly walking forward, shifting its stance by holding the blade pointing forward from the right side while its left hand was held parallel to the ground as it pointed towards the Uchiha. A.N. Basically think the basic combat stance of the ringwraiths from the Fellowship of the Ring. Sasuke smirked arrogantly and drew a kunai knife, intent to take down this thing. The creature chuckled once again and blocked Sasuke's sloppy kunai stab with its sword before backhanding the last Uchiha across the face, sending him flying straight into a tree. Sasuke groaned and sat up. The wraith snickered for a second. I always thought you were strong. I guess I was wrong, Teme, the wraith hissed as it lunged towards Sasuke. Sasuke was stunned. Nobody called him that except Naruto? He asked right as the wraith slammed the hilt of its sword into the Uchiha's forehead, and all Sasuke saw was blackness. Naruto Pav. Naruto sneered a bit as he knelt down by the unconscious teen. He rolled his eyes for a moment before flipping through his hand signs. Sorry Orochi-chan, but this bastard doesn't need any more power. The temptation factor of the seal is still there, so you won't have to worry. He'll come in time, Naruto thought. Evil sealing technique. Fuin. Fuin equals seal. He rasped as a small black ring with 8 prongs formed around the seal. He nodded in approval. Sasuke could forcibly remove the blocking seal he had just placed, but it would take a lot of chakra which Sasuke didn't have. Naruto stood and glanced over at his pink-haired teammate, only to find her not laying on the ground in shock like she had been a moment earlier. He turned to find her standing protectively over Sasuke. I won't let you hurt Sasuke-kun, she growled, attempting to sound menacing. That in itself is hard enough to pull off when you look about as threatening as a newborn kitten, and the fact that the kunai in her clasped hands was shaking did little to make her seem terrifying. Naruto shook his head and pointed at the Uchiha. Do not come between a Nazgul and his prey. It is most unwise. Sakura tilted her head for a moment before Naruto looked her in the eyes. His eyes were now purple with 2 tomo in each eye. Sleep, he ordered. Sakura passed out immediately. The Witch King's successor shook his head in disgust. Orochimaru slithered down from a tree and cancelled her slithering snake mode as she looked upon Naruto's form. Needless to say, she was impressed. Naruto took off his helmet and looked at the Sannin. Sorry about sealing his curse mark, but I don't want the leaf to freak out if he loses control of it. Orochimaru raised an eyebrow. Oh? Why not? Naruto sighed. Then they lock him up to the point where he'll never escape to come and join you, or they'll kill him if the Hokage has any say. Either way, your plan fails and I don't get to leave this hellhole, Naruto elaborated. Orochimaru nodded and proceeded to look the blonde up and down. His blonde hair was a bit longer, more like Minato's hairstyle, and his whisker marks seemed darker and jagged. As it was, his hair also was a darker shade of blonde, with streaks of black and purple going through his bangs, with the tips of the hair at the sides of his face blood red. His face held no trace of baby fat, looking rugged and rough, almost as if he was carved out of stone. Orochimaru subconsciously licked her lips. To her, Naruto was a prime specimen of a man, and needless to say she wanted that specimen, given her experimenting obsession. Naruto groaned and hefted the two genin over his shoulders. I better go, don't want to keep the exams waiting, he said. Orochimaru smirked and tossed him a heaven scroll. You'll need that then in order to get in, she said teasingly. Naruto grunted as he stowed the scroll somewhere in his robes. You'll need to get out of here before your old apprentice shows up. No doubt she sensed both your chakra and whatever that was that shot out when I transformed. And we both know that if you're captured, the leaf won't hesitate to kill you. Besides, Naruto flashed in front of the Sannin, causing her to jump in shock. I still want that date you promised me, he said in an equally teasing manner. Orochimaru fought the blush that made its way onto her paled face. Naruto grinned and disappeared in a flash of purple. Orochimaru cursed. Damn it, she shook her head and smiled. You always knew how to keep a girl wanting more, Naruto-kun? She mused, licking her lips once again. As he trudged through the forest with the two unconscious genin slung across his back, the successor of the Witch King contemplated waking them up or not. Naruto finally decided against it and resolved to keep walking. This slowly began to become more difficult as he progressed, for while his strength and stamina were formidable they still had limits. Naruto swore angrily under his breath as he kept walking, almost wanting to let Sasuke drag against the forest floor. Hey Kurama, is there some way to carry them without actually having to, carry them? He raged to the fox. Dunno, you're the successor of a ringwrath. You tell me. Cursing the Biju under his breath, Naruto kept on making his way in the direction of the tower. Idly extending his senses, he found Orochimaru playing with her old apprentice in a dance of death. Chuckling softly, Naruto pulled his helmet off of his belt and put it on. Pondering an option, he raised a hand and held it out in front of him. Dropping Sasuke and Sakura, he held them in the air with dark magic, carefully levitating them so he didn't, accidentally, drop them while they floated. Wouldn't do for him to harm the precious Uchiha heir, now wouldn't it? Walking along, he wondered to himself if he could summon a horse or something to use as a mount. But since he didn't know how to do that, he decided against experimenting until he found a decent place to practice his new abilities. Naruto eyed his gauntleted hand for a moment before shaking his head. This was rather baffling, and he needed to figure out just what about him had changed. Arriving at the tower, Naruto dropped his two teammates on the ground. Pulling the two scrolls out of the cavernous pockets of his robes, he examined them for a moment. Flipping them open, he tossed them on the ground to form an X shape, revealing the summoning seal formed by the overlapping scrolls. A cloud of smoke exploded into existence before fading to reveal Iruka. The scar-faced Chunin immediately pulled a double take at the sight of his old student. Naruto, what the hell happened to you? He asked. Naruto shrugged. I grew up. Slinging Sasuke and Sakura over his shoulders, he walked past the Chunin and into the tower. Chucking the two at Kakashi once he saw him, Naruto continued on his way. He had a feeling that things were going to get much more interesting in the next few days. Stepping into one of the free rooms, Naruto sat down on the bed and gazed at the helmet in his arms. So Kurama, what's next? You got me on that one kid. You got me, the fox responded. Naruto simply rolled his eyes at the fox's response before stretching his arms behind his head and lounging back. This is rather strange, he mused to himself. Who'd have thought that the village pariah, the container of the Kyuubi, would become the successor to such a legendary figure of darkness? Things just might be looking up for me. Naruto rolled over onto his side and closed his eyes. It would be best to rest for now, and see just how things had changed come the third exam. Couple of hours later, our blonde-haired hero was awakened rather rudely by a loud banging on his door. Glaring at the offending object, Naruto stood up and cracked his neck before walking to the door. I'm telling you, you better have a good ray. His words were cut off at the sight of the man standing in his doorway. Standing there was a man who appeared to be old and frail, but radiated power. One arm was bandaged and slung into a black sling, while bandages wrapped around his right eye. Spiky black hair fell over the bandages, and his eye was squinted almost to the point of being shut. An X-shaped scar crossed his chin, and his face was covered in wrinkles. He held a cane in his hand, but Naruto knew he was by no means a feeble old man. Naruto stiffened slightly before inclining his head. Danzo-sensei, he remarked coolly. Danzo nodded at Naruto before shuffling into the room. Turning back to face the blonde, Danzo's squinted eye opened slightly to look at his apprentice. Naruto, the old man replied. I'm glad to see that you made it through the forest of death, despite your teammates, Danzo said, almost snarling out the word teammates. While he could tell the necessity of the Uchiha, he cared little for his attitude or his pink-haired fangirl. Yeah, no thanks to them, Naruto growled. Danzo nodded before peering at the Jinchuriki's hair. What happened to you, boy? Naruto turned to Danzo and scratched the back of his head sheepishly. Well, it's kind of a long story there, old man. Danzo raised an eyebrow before shaking his head. If any of my root agents talked to me that way, I'd have them executed. Luckily I'm fond of you for reasons I can't fathom, Danzo remarked. A vein bulged on Naruto's forehead. Say what? Who asked you, ya old goat? He yelled. Danzo twitched. He twitched again. And again. Then he exploded. What did you call me, you insufferable brat? Danzo bellowed, fire billowing out of his visible eye, the rage palpable. While Hiruzen might tolerate your antics, I have no such tolerance and you know this. And with that, Danzo raised his cane and slammed it down onto the blonde Uzumaki's head. Ow! Why'd you hit me, old man? Naruto yelled, his icy blue eyes bleeding over into red. The cane slammed down on his temple again. Ow! God! Why do you keep doing that? I'll do it until you learn some respect for your elders, you hooligan. Naruto froze. You realize you just called yourself old, right, sensei? Danzo froze, cane stopping mid-swing. He took a moment to contemplate. Danzo lowered the cane and his head sunk. Goddammit, he growled under his breath. The blonde smirked and chuckled lightly. Danzo glared at Naruto, a vein still twitching on his temple. You may have won this round, brat, he snarled. But you have not won the war. Naruto waved a hand dismissively at his fuming sensei. Danzo groaned and sat down, rubbing a hand over his wrinkled face. Naruto reached into his black robes and pulled out a small metal flask. After unscrewing the cap off of the flask, he then handed it to his sensei. Danzo looked at it for a moment before taking a swig of the sake inside. Still don't understand how they let you buy this stuff, brat, Danzo muttered. Old enough to kill, old enough to drink and get laid, Naruto retorted. Danzo rolled his visible eye. With a certain snake summoner, Naruto turned a bit pink. That's none of your concern, ya old goat. He bellowed as his blush intensified at the thought of his other, far better-looking sensei, and him in one of those situations. Danzo chuckled. Still got it, he murmured to himself. Composing himself, Danzo looked at the side of Naruto's neck. How's the mark? He asked. Naruto perked up and strained to look at the curse mark on his skin. It doesn't twinge or anything, but I haven't used it yet. After discovering this new form of power, I just didn't need it at the time, he admitted. Danzo nodded. I recommend you keep this new power of yours in the dark for a little bit longer. We wouldn't want them to get too suspicious of you and call for the demon's execution, now would we? Naruto nodded and closed his eyes. The robes turned slightly translucent before melting into Naruto's skin, the armor turning black as night with purple energy glowing at the edges before dissipating into nothingness, revealing Naruto's old orange jacket and pants below it. The helmet sitting beside him quickly followed suit, dissipating in a flash of black and purple-edged energy. Danzo nodded in approval. Good, now they'll underestimate you like they have before. But one last note. With that he stood and got right in Naruto's face. Lose. The damned. Orange, he growled, an aura in the shape of the Shinigami's mask appearing behind his head. Naruto gulped subtly, nodding furiously. The aura vanished, and a small smile graced Danzo's face. Good. I'll send Fu or Torun to bring you a set of root-approved clothing to wear in place of that thing, Danzo replied, his face scowling at the thought of the orange clothing. And with that note, the old man turned and walked out of the room and into the hallway, the clicking of his cane on the stone floor echoing throughout the tower. Naruto shook his head in amazement. While never showing that much emotion in public, he still was amazed at how much emotion Danzo expressed in his presence. He never even knew the old goat still had that much emotion in him. Naruto simply laid back on his bed and closed his eyes, a small smile gracing his features. While he still saw Danzo as a grandfather figure like the Hokage and a good teacher, he still preferred Orochimaru. She was a bit easier on the eyes. Later, at the arena for the third stage of the Chunin exams, Most of the genin participating in the exams were a little bit baffled with the change that had come over the village, Dobi, sometime during the exams. He wasn't loudly screaming about becoming Hokage, he wasn't pestering his pink-haired teammate for a date, and he wasn't wearing any orange. Instead, his whisker-marked face was set into an expression of cool indifference, not even reacting to the whispers around him. The clothing Naruto was wearing was also a bit of a shock. Gone was the orange and blue tracksuit, but was replaced with something that actually made him look like a shinobi for once. He was wearing what appeared to be black Anbu-grade pants and sandals with bandages wrapped around his ankles, a shirt of deep purple with a strange spiral symbol on the chest, as well as a hooded cloak similar to that of the fourth Hokage. The differences ended there, for the cloak had a hood instead of a high collar, and was black with purple flames instead of white with red flames. Instead of kanji reading, fourth Hokage, Naruto instead had a large number, 9, printed on the back in red ink. The blue fabric of his forehead protector was exchanged for a black one with longer straps hanging off of the back of his head. The genin weren't exactly sure, but to them it seemed as if his hair was styled like Minato Namikaze, excepting the black and purple streaks in his bangs and the red tips of the hair framing his face. Most of them had differing reactions to Naruto's new look, some being surprised while some chalked it up to him, trying to look good to impress them and failing miserably. Cough. Cough. Sakura. Cough. Cough. Naruto simply ignored them and their whisperings, preferring instead to glance over to the balcony on the opposite side. Naruto couldn't help but smirk at the sight of the female Jonin sensei of the sound team. Her yellow eyes glinted at the sight of the blonde, her pupils turning to snake-like slits for a moment. She simply raised a finger to her lips, a coy smirk aimed at Naruto. Inwardly, Naruto couldn't help but shake his head at the security of the leaf. They knew what their greatest traitor other than Itachi looked like exactly, yet she simply stood in the room mere feet away from the Hokage himself with the only thing different about her was her sound Jonin uniform and nobody noticed her at all. Talk about slacking off. You said it, kid. You said it, Kurama rumbled in the back of Naruto's mind. Naruto chuckled softly. Looking back at the Hokage, he noticed that the old man had finished his speech and the new proctor had shown up, a sickly-looking Jonin called Hayate. After a brief explanation of how the preliminaries would work, the electronic board cycled through the names until it came up against two names. Sasuke Uchiha versus Akadu Yoroi. Naruto scoffed under his breath. Of course they'd show the emo first. Not surprising at all. They really think he's the best they have? Kurama growled. Why can't they just focus on some of the actual geniuses and not the arrogant clan heirs? Bastards are far too stuck on the Uchihas these days. Naruto couldn't help but shake his head while leaping up to the balcony. He glanced down to see his duck-haired teammate preparing to face off against Kabuto's teammate. He chuckled under his breath. Despite Yoroi's enhancement, Sasuke would probably still defeat him. Yoroi just didn't stand a chance. Subtly casting a genjutsu over his eyes, Naruto activated his purple Sharingan to observe the fight. Sure enough, Sasuke's chakra network was currently straining against the dark chakra of Orochimaru's curse mark. Naruto narrowed his eyes slightly when he noticed that his suppression seal was missing. What the hell? How'd the suppression seal get removed? He thought to himself. Glancing over at Orochimaru, he drew a circular motion around the side of his neck, almost in a pattern over his own seal. She simply shrugged. Naruto scowled. Either some outside force had removed the seal he placed over the curse mark, the mark itself forced the seal off, or Naruto's fuinjutsu, sealing techniques, skills weren't quite up to par yet. Knowing it was most likely the last of the theories, Naruto simply sighed and made a mental note to practice his seals whenever he got the chance. Shaking himself out of his thoughts, he saw Sasuke kick his opponent into the air using a taijutsu move that he, most likely, copied from the spandex-wearing genin of Team 9. After kicking the hapless Yoroi into the air, Sasuke prepared for another strike. Glancing back over to Orochimaru, Naruto noticed her sudden predatory grin as she raised her fingers into a half of a hand seal. Turning his gaze back to Sasuke, Naruto immediately noticed the sudden influx of dark chakra spreading from the curse mark. Black flame-shaped marks began spreading from Sasuke's neck onto his face and the rest of his body, causing him to flinch in midair. A grimace found its way onto his face before he steeled himself and forced the mark back into submission, then slamming Yoroi to the ground with a devastating kick while yelling, "Shishi Renden." Lion's Barrage. Sasuke was then pronounced the winner, and quickly escorted off by Kakashi to get that mark sealed up, while the board began to spin once more to choose the next fighters. His gaze following Kakashi and Sasuke's retreating forms, Naruto quickly held his hands into the familiar cross seal and substituted himself with a Kage Bunshin. He then held a hand out in front of him and began channeling that dark energy from before when he used his new powers. After coating himself in a layer of shadows to camouflage himself, Naruto stuck to the ceiling with chakra and followed after the two. Ceiling room. Minutes later, clinging to a pillar, Naruto carefully observed as Kakashi removed Sasuke's shirt and began tracing seals all over the Uchiha's torso with his own blood. After finishing the arduous task, Kakashi began channeling chakra to the curse mark in the center of the seals and began the same sealing process Naruto himself had used barely a day ago. Although Naruto grudgingly admitted that Kakashi's method was slightly better than his own, given he actually took time to make the seals instead of half-assing it. After the seal was applied, and the Uchiha passed out, Naruto was set to leave when he heard the familiar chuckling he had come to know and love, while most of Konoha only associated it with fear. "Kukuku," Orochimaru chuckled as she leaned against the doorway of the room. "Seems you've gotten better at sealing, haven't you, copycat Kakashi?" she replied in a teasing manner. Kakashi quickly spun on his heels, kunai in hand, while his other hand was instantly on his forehead protector. "You," he growled. A smirk found its way onto Orochimaru's face. "Me," she replied, fanged smirk never leaving her expression. "So, the curse mark was your doing after all. You do realize I'm not letting you take Sasuke, don't you?" Kakashi snarled. Orochimaru lowered her eyes, a small frown on her face, her lower lip trembling slightly. The look vanished when she looked back up and let a maniacal smile form as her golden eyes gleamed. "Take Sasuke? Why, Hitaki, I thought you knew me better. Why would I want him?" she said. "I may be one for going for younger men, but I don't think that a revenge-driven emo isn't really my type. I tend to go for the ones with the real strength if you ask me. Sasuke's good only for a pawn maybe, but that's all." Kakashi's eye widened before narrowing. "Then why mark him? Why the obsession over the Sharingan if you're not going to use him like that?" he remarked. Orochimaru laughed heartily for a good minute or two before letting her amusement die off. "Who says I still don't want the Sharingan?" she said with a smirk. "Of course, I'd only get them after Sasuke's use for me ran out, but I've waited long enough. Besides, I don't need to take him. He'll come to me for power." "What?" Kakashi yelled, his headband now lifted up to reveal his own Sharingan eye. "You heard me. He'll come willingly to me for power." "They always do," Orochimaru replied. "After all, he's already had a taste of power from my curse mark. He'll come to me for more. That's how it always goes." Naruto fought the urge to chuckle as his sensei from the fairer end of the spectrum simply talked Kakashi Hitaki down like scolding a child. Sensing something from his clone, Naruto slipped out of the room and used a Kawamari substitution with his clone and processed the memories from when it dispelled. Filing away the information as needed, Naruto then turned his gaze back to the board as the two names appeared. Ino Yamanaka vs Sakura Haruno. About a half-hour later, Naruto couldn't help but let some of his disgust show through his emotionless mask, a vein pulsing noticeably on his temple. The fight had basically been a so-called catfight between two mediocre kunoichi. While Ino had some advantage due to her clan upbringing and therefore could have become an excellent ninja, she basically crippled herself due to dieting to help her figure. When it came to attracting Sasuke-kun's attention, Sakura was no better. In fact, she was a lot worse. She didn't even train at all. Not to mention even Sasuke, who had returned to watch the matches shortly after the two girls got into the arena, was a bit disgusted. The raven-haired Uchiha couldn't help but shake his head in shame at his teammates' proclamations that she would win Sasuke-kun's love with this match, and Ino's hot-headed remarks. Add in the fact that the two kunoichi only used the Academy 3 in terms of jutsu, minus Ino's single Yamanaka mind jutsu, and that they both knocked each other out at the same time, and the fight was all in all rather pathetic. Naruto glanced over to where Orochimaru, once again in her disguise, and he couldn't help but smirk at her reaction. Her beautiful features were twisted into a scowl of horror and disgust with a hint of outrage thrown in, her golden eyes narrowed in fury, and Naruto could probably guess why. Female ninja were often seen as weaker than male ninja, and fangirls like the blonde Yamanaka and the banshee Pinkhead just added to that stereotype. This was often the reason that some enemy shinobi tended to underestimate kunoichi. Of course, this stereotype of the weak woman was broken in some cases like Tsunade Senju, or Orochimaru herself, the Sannin and others such as Anko Mitarashi or Kurenai Yuhi. Still, fangirls were often considered a disgrace to the shinobi ranks. Chuckling inwardly at Orochimaru's expression, Naruto turned back to the electronic board as the names stopped once more. Naruto Uzumaki vs Kiba Inuzuka. Sweet. We got this one in the bag, Akamaru. The boisterous dog user bellowed, his white puppy giving a half-hearted bark in reply. Naruto let a small smirk form on his face. Seconds after the Inuzuka leapt down to the arena, Naruto simply stuck his hands in his pockets and disappeared in a swirl of shadow. The shadowy Shunshin, body flicker, reappeared a few feet across from Kiba, fading to reveal Naruto standing there in its place. Kakashi raised an eyebrow at the display. Since when did Naruto know the Shunshin? I never taught him that. Sasuke seethed for a moment but forced himself to calm down. It wouldn't do to get angry at a loser for knowing a new trick, now would it? The proctor raised a hand, then lowered it to signal the beginning of the match. Kiba leapt forward, his hand formed into a clawing motion as he tried to use his family taijutsu on Naruto. He was a little annoyed when Naruto simply leaned backwards, effortlessly dodging the feral style. Kiba was shaken out of his thoughts when Naruto, still not taking his hands out of his pockets, dropped down and swept his feet out from under him with a swift kick, before spinning and slamming his own foot into Kiba's stomach. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of the Inuzuka, and sent him flying across the room. Naruto eyed Kiba as the boy pulled himself from the wall he was embedded in. Well, guess that's about all you can do then. Kiba growled angrily before dropping down on his hands and knees. Shikyaku no Jutsu. 4 legs technique, he bellowed. Chakra enveloped him as his canines extended into fangs and his nails elongated into claws. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the display before smirking. So, you want to go wild then? He asked. Immediately a spike of yokai emitted from him as his slightly thicker than usual whisker marks thickened even more. His own canines turned to fangs and his nails to claws. Naruto's icy blue eyes bled over into red with a cat-like slit for a pupil. Seconds later, almost subconsciously, the chakra turned slightly darker as the curse mark hidden under his collar activated. Deep in Naruto's subconscious, Kurama's cage, Kurama's eyes snapped open as he felt the mark activate. Ah hell, he growled, as black markings began to slowly overtake the sewer-like area of Naruto's mindscape. Real world. Much to the surprise of the Jonins watching, the right side of Naruto's face was slowly covered with black markings similar in shape to spiked chains with spear-like attachments at the tips. A.N. Basically think of the shape of Kushina's chakra chains, then make them black. That's basically what Naruto's stage 1 curse mark looks like. Naruto's mouth split into a wide, bloodthirsty grin. Let's go wild then. The Jinchuriki roared in a demonic tone as he lunged on all fours towards the Inuzuka and his partner. End chapter. Nah, just kidding. I had to do this with at least one of my stories. Okay, let's just get back to business then. I'll finish the match in the very least with this chapter. Kiba lunged to the side to avoid the demonically enhanced Naruto as he swung a clawed hand at the Inuzuka's mostly unprotected neck. He then trusted his instincts enough to duck and avoid another barrage of kicks and slashes. Inwardly, Kiba was on the verge of panic. Naruto was moving faster than most of his clan members after using the Shikyaku no Jutsu and was even more feral than just about all of them. Letting out a whistle to Akamaru, Kiba quickly tossed a soldier pill to the puppy. Akamaru swallowed the pill and quickly turned a shade of burgundy. Let's go Akamaru, Kiba yelled as the dog jumped onto his back. Jujin Bunshin, beast human clone. With an explosion of smoke, Akamaru transformed into a perfect double of Kiba. The two Kibas darted to the side and began to spin as they charged. Gatsuga, fang over fang. Immediately the two began rotating into a spinning drill of wind and claws. Naruto simply cackled maniacally as he stood his ground. Bring it on, ya mangy mutts. Up in the stands, most of the genin were in complete shock over Naruto's transformation. Neji's eyes were bulging, Hinata had a horrified expression on her face, Choji had dropped his chips, Shikamaru was paying attention for once, and Shino was, well, Shino. Sasuke was a bit taken aback when he noticed the same black markings forming on Naruto's skin. The Dobi has one of these marks too? When did that woman give him one? He wondered to himself. What also startled him slightly was the fact that Naruto was going even more berserk than he did in his first usage of the mark. The other Jonin were a little worried, given Naruto was using the Kyuubi's chakra, and most of them were praying for Kiba and Akamaru's sakes. Kakashi on the other hand had lifted his headband to reveal his Sharingan and was gazing at Naruto's chakra with a concerned look in his eyes. Bad enough he's using the fox's chakra, but he got a curse mark too? Did Orochimaru mark him as well? Kakashi glanced over to where he knew Orochimaru was standing with her remaining student, and he was a bit shocked at the look on her face. She wasn't using a hand seal to activate the mark, and her face showed surprise and, oddly enough, concern. This makes little sense. Not only does Naruto have a curse mark, but Orochimaru's actually looking concerned for him? What does this mean? He thought to himself. Back in the arena, Naruto simply leapt into the air as the two drill-like objects rocketed towards him, before landing on the floor with a crater forming under his feet. He cackled again, this time ready to catch the Inuzuka and his puppy as they shot towards him again. Alright, that's enough. Immediately the foul yokai of the Kyuubi receded back into the seal, leaving Naruto with only the curse mark active. Naruto's maniacal expression slowly morphed into one of confusion as he raised a hand to the mark on his neck. You freaking idiot, not only have you revealed the curse mark, but you almost lost control of my chakra. Sorry kid, but I'm putting you on cold turkey here. No more yokai until you get that mark sorted out and under control. Kurama yelled from the mindscape. Naruto shook the cobwebs out of his mind just in time to dodge Kiba and Akamaru's technique once more. Glaring at the two drills that swerved and shot back at him again, his red eyes bled back into icy blue. Alright you two, he said in an emotionless tone. Let's finish this. With that, Naruto flipped through his hand signs and turned to the drill on the right. Futon. Shinkua. Wind style. Vacuum wave. Naruto bellowed as he spun on his heels and fired off a blade of wind from his mouth. The wind blade immediately struck the spinning object head-on and coupled with the spinning destructive power of Gatsuga it quickly decimated the person in question. This was revealed to be the real Kiba, now covered with small slash wounds all over his body from the wind rotating around his technique. Akamaru released his transformation and ran over to Kiba, barking frantically. The proctor, seeing Kiba on the ground, shakily raised a hand. Winner by knockout. Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto sighed in relief as the chain-shaped marks on his face receded into the mark on his neck. Glancing up for a moment at Orochimaru, he was happy to see her smiling at him. He fought down the blush that almost appeared when she subtly winked at him. He turned back to see the medics taking Kiba away on a stretcher. His joints groaning in protest, Naruto quickly made his way over to the Inuzuka. Hey, Kiba. Kiba raised a head with a groan to see Naruto extending a hand. Sorry about losing it for a bit there. You put up a good fight though. Good match? Naruto asked. Kiba forced a smile onto his face with a wince. Yeah, good match, Dobi, he groaned as he passed out. Naruto gave a small smile before Kakashi put a hand on his shoulder. He groaned inwardly. This could take a while. Needless to say, Naruto was sitting in the same circle that Sasuke was sitting in over half an hour ago, and he wasn't in the best of moods. Part of him was pissed over the fact that now he'd have to go through the trouble of figuring out how to unlock the seal Kakashi was putting over his curse mark, but even more annoying was that he had lost control of the seal itself as well as his emotions. Now, he was going to lose two of his greatest advantages. I don't know why you didn't tell me you got marked as well, Naruto, Kakashi said as he began flipping through his hand signs. We could have gotten this taken care of sooner. Naruto rolled his eyes. Really? And why in the name of the Shinigami would I have told you about this? He growled. Kakashi's visible eye narrowed slightly. Well, I am your sensei Naruto, so wouldn't it make sense to? The silver-haired Jonin was cut off when Naruto started chuckling softly, the sound getting progressively louder until the teen was laughing hysterically. You, my sensei? Huh, that's a good one, Hitaki. Kakashi sighed wearily as he bit his finger and began drawing the various seals across Naruto's body, all centered around the shuriken-shaped curse mark on his neck. Well, I was assigned your Jonin sensei Naruto, so I still think you should treat me as such. And what have you actually taught me, Hitaki? What have you taught me? Tree walking. That's it. Besides, I can already get a good idea as to why you were put as my sensei in the first place, and it wasn't just to teach Uchiha Teme. Kakashi momentarily stopped his seal writing for a moment before continuing. And what would that be? He asked lazily. That eye of yours. Don't think I don't know what it can do to Biju. The furball already made note of his displeasure of having not only an Uchiha but another Sharingan user as well. You're here to make sure that what happened in the arena in the preliminaries doesn't happen again. That is, if you can actually suppress the fox in the first place. Kakashi was troubled as Naruto spoke. How did he know of the latent ability that the council believed that all Sharingan had? Sure, only Madara Uchiha was the only one of the Uchiha clan to ever show the ability, but the council believed that all Sharingan had the ability. And the way he mockingly called the fox a furball seemed to denote that he had at least made contact with the fox once before, and at least knew it enough to tease the beast. Even more troubling, now that he thought about it, was Orika's barely noticeable concern during the preliminaries when Naruto lost control of the curse mark and the Kyuubi's chakra. Why on earth would the most heartless of the Sannin seem concerned for Naruto? Maybe she simply needed to be sure that one of her possible pawns wouldn't be executed for his Jinchuriki status. Yeah, something like that, Kakashi thought as he slapped a hand down on Naruto's curse mark and began the sealing. Naruto, despite having a rather high pain tolerance from his training with a specific old warhawk, had no choice but to grit his teeth and fight the scream that tore through his throat. The bloody seals drawn on his body began pulsing and slowly shrinking. The shuriken-shaped curse mark began to glow a fiery orange as the surrounding markings began constricting it. Fuja Hoin, evil sealing technique. With Kakashi's words, the seal finished its constriction, forming the similar circular mark with prongs jutting out at various intervals. Naruto fell to his hands and knees, gasping for breath. Raising a hand to the curse mark, he swore silently. Based on the suppression seal placed over it, he had a feeling that this one, while still the same as Sasuke's, was probably stronger than the one he saw Kakashi use earlier. Batting aside the silver-haired man's offered hand, Naruto staggered to his feet and headed for the door, hand still placed over the mark. It's your own fault, Naruto, Kurama said from within the seal. If you hadn't decided to try and one-up the mutt with my power, you wouldn't have lost control of that mark, and we wouldn't be in this current situation. Yeah, I get it. Naruto snarked back at the fox. Were you really serious about cutting me off? Of course I was. If you end up going berserk every time you use my chakra just because you can't control the curse mark, then we can't have that. If you want to truly be strong, you need control, and that takes discipline that you obviously don't have as of now, Kurama retorted. Get that mark under control, then we'll talk about letting you use my power again. And with that, the strongest of the 9 Biju cut the link and promptly fell asleep. Naruto rolled his eyes as he heard the faint sound of snoring in the back of his head. After finding his shirt and cloak from where Kakashi tossed them in the hallway, he got himself looking reasonable and walked back into the arena. Hayate noticed the blonde walking back into the arena. There you are. Come get a number, then look at the board once you have gotten it. Naruto reached into the basket and looked at the slip of paper in his hand. 1, he remarked with a smirk. Glancing up at the board, he almost wanted to bust out laughing when he saw his planned opponent. Naruto Uzumaki vs Neji Hyuga. Naruto grinned a bit wider and glanced over at Neji. Neji had an impassive expression on his face, but Naruto could already tell that the arrogant branch member was obviously underestimating him like so many others did. With that done, Naruto turned on his heel and began striding towards the exit of the arena. He had quite a bit of work to do in order to get ready. While he didn't think defeating Neji would be too difficult for him to do, he wasn't planning on underestimating the Hyuga like he had done for Naruto. Neji wasn't called a prodigy for nothing, And if he was still a prodigy while being shackled into the branch family of the Hyuga, then that really said something about his skill. Naruto chuckled darkly under his breath. It seemed that he might have to reveal his newfound powers after all. Later, at one of the training grounds, standing by one of the wooden posts in the middle of the field, Naruto was simply standing motionless as he reached deep within the recesses of his soul. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled. Inhaled, then exhaled. Slowly, the familiar cold feeling of that power lying within him began to surface. Naruto exhaled again, a cool mist billowing from his mouth despite the warm air around him. Shadows began to slowly rise around him, like tendrils of some lurking beast below the ground reaching up to grasp its prey. The shadows formed like a black mist around his feet, before rising and sliding up his back and down over his front. Naruto's eyes snapped open, revealing purple irises with two tomo arranged in a circle around the pupils. The shadows began to lose their translucent quality, billowing over his body before settling in the form of the familiar black robes. This time, however, only the gauntlets and boots formed from the now green-tinged dark energy, and the robes had longer sleeves falling down to his wrists. The shadows finished their transformation by flowing over Naruto's head and forming a hood filled with darkness that no light could pierce. Naruto eyed his new form for a couple of seconds, before reaching towards his side. Immediately the broadsword from before appeared in a swirl of shadow at his side. Naruto placed a hand on the hilt of the sword before drawing it from its scabbard in a swift motion. He gazed at the blade for a few more moments before lowering it. "Kurama, do you know anything about the sword styles of the Nazgul? I do have a basic idea for the style, but the rest of it will probably need to be recreated by you in your own way." Each of the Nazgul had their own unique way of fighting, and if I remember correctly, the Witch King used a mixture of magic and swordsmanship in his fighting style, the fox responded. Naruto cut the link and pulled back his hood. He lifted his head and gazed up into the sky, his eyes focused on the moon above. His purple Sharingan deactivated, fading away to reveal his usual ice blue irises. He lowered his head and closed his eyes once more. At that moment he heard a small rustle in the bushes to his right. A small smirk found its way onto Naruto's face. "You do know you really need to wash off the scent of rubbing alcohol and snakes if you ever plan on sneaking on me," he remarked to open air. Slipping out from behind a tree, Orika smirked as she beheld her P-Suedo apprentice. "Well, you do know how to recognize a girl, Naruto-kun," she remarked, a glint of amusement apparent in her golden eyes. Naruto rolled his eyes and gave a small smile. "Well, you just had the bad luck to come find me after you've probably finished dissecting some poor sap," he retorted. Orika chuckled before brushing her bangs back behind her ear. "Alright, fine. I just happened to make a breakthrough on that ingenious technique of the Nidaime Hokages. I feel it might be useful at some point in the future." Naruto's golden eyebrow quirked. "Which one? The one my father used or the other one?" Orika's smirk got a little bit wider. "The other one. Let's just say that the sound team I sent didn't measure up, so I had to end their careers rather suddenly. I'm afraid they won't be around for a while," she said in a far too innocent-sounding tone of voice. She glanced at the sword in Naruto's gauntleted fist. "Kenjutsu? Sword techniques?" she asked. One of the key features of the Wraiths was their swordsmanship. I figured I should try and make my own version. Orika's grin came back in full force as she opened her mouth widely. The hilt of the kusanagi slid up out of her throat and into her waiting hand. She drew the sword fully out of her mouth and licked her lips. "Well then, care to have a little dance, Naruto-kun?" she said teasingly, kusanagi readied in her signature kenjutsu form. Naruto grinned back at his second sensei. "It would be my pleasure," he replied as he pulled his hood back up, once again hiding his face in shadow. His eyes flashed purple as his Sharingan activated. "I hope you don't mind if I copy a few parts of your style to add to mine," he remarked as he raised one hand out and held it parallel to the ground, his other hand pulled back slightly with the tip of the sword pointed right at her. Orika smirked. "Fine by me. The Sharingan is a tool you should use." Orika spun the kusanagi in a quick circle at her side. "I hope you at least know how to use that blade. Maybe with the Sharingan you might actually make me submit to you this time," she said with teasing lilt in her voice. Unseen by the shadows of his hood, Naruto's cheeks flared pink when he realized the other connotation of the phrase Orika had just uttered. The two stood still, neither moving an inch. One could mistake them for statues with how they never moved. A faint breeze blew in, causing several leaves to be dislodged from their branches. A single leaf blew away from the others, floating down towards the two combatants. The leaf touched the ground in between them, and they moved. If one were to come upon the scene, they would have been very shocked to see what appeared to be a wraith of old facing off against the only traitor in the legendary Sannin. A dance consisting of battle that neither would be hard-pressed to forget. Naruto darted forward in a lunging stab, blade extended. His sword connected with Orika's kusanagi. The snake Sannin knocked his sword out of the deadlock and spun in a circle, apparently aiming for his throat. The cloaked blonde ducked under the slash and rolled to his left. Naruto rose and raised his sword to block another slash from Orika. Shoving her sword out of the way, he dashed towards her with a horizontal slash. The snake Sannin's only response was to show off the serpentine flexibility she had been working on for years to bend around the blade and lunge towards him with the kusanagi. The blade only just missed Naruto, but still managed to cut a decent-sized gash on his shoulder. The hooded blonde flipped back and got into a slightly more cautious stance, his Sharingan still carefully memorizing the movements Orochimaru used. Glancing down at his free hand, Naruto felt a sudden rush of power. His right hand glowed an ethereal blue, almost looking transparent with flame-like energy rolling off the limb. Grinning, Naruto disappeared in a shadowy shunshin before reappearing behind Orochimaru. Curling his hand into a fist, Naruto punched the air, firing off a fist-sized wave of the ethereal blue energy right at his pseudo-sensei. The wave impacted with Orika's back, freezing her in place for a few seconds, the surprise evident on her face. Running forward, Naruto began slashing wildly at her in a manner akin to a berserker. Much to the Sannin's amazement, as his first attack connected, an ethereal afterimage of what appeared to be a desiccated corpse-like figure wearing robes and a spiked crown emerged from Naruto's body, following up each of his attacks with a duplication of the same attack. With a final blow, enhanced by the doppelganger attacking at the same time, Naruto sent Orika flying a few feet away, where she collapsed on her knees. Naruto grinned behind his hood. Orika mirrored the smirk before chuckling, followed by Naruto doing the same. The two just sat in their current positions, one on the ground and the other standing with a blade drawn, just laughing. Orika finally managed to stop laughing long enough to cough violently before shedding her skin in the usual manner that she did. Naruto eyed the dissolving skin for a moment before shaking his head. "No matter how many times I see that technique still creeps me out," he remarked. Orika laughed again. Reaching down to where she dropped it, Orochimaru picked up the kusanagi, stuck it in her mouth point first, and swallowed the entire sword. She licked her lips for a moment and smiled. Naruto fought down the urge to shudder. It still creeped him out. "So Naruto-kun, what exactly was that you just did?" Orika asked. Naruto shrugged. "No idea. It was sort of instinctive. Almost like I remembered it or something." "That was an ability used by someone possessed by a wraith long ago, brat," Kurama remarked, the fox finally speaking after some time of remaining silent. "He was a ranger of old, who after a great tragedy that he was forced to watch, ended up merged with the spirit of a wraith." "Someone else was like me?" "Not quite. He simply held the spirit of an elven ruler who was turned into a wraith after death by his own greed and lust for power. You hold the powers of the Witch King, which was the strongest of the Nazgul, and was strong enough to even go toe-to-toe with their lord and master in a spar. That other wraith won't even be able to hold a candle to your strength." Naruto smirked to himself. Then he paused for a moment and thought about one thing. Why was the fox speaking like he knew the man personally? As he continued thinking, he thought more about how the fox knew about the Nazgul as well. Kurama spoke as if he had been around when the Nazgul were at full power, but if the Sage of the Six Paths was after the time of the Nazgul, then how did Kurama know all of this? Kurama? The fox knew exactly what Naruto was about to ask. "Listen kid, I'll tell you when I'm ready. But some secrets aren't ready to be known to the world just yet." "What kind of an answer is that?" "It's just more cryptic bullshit." "Kurama, are you listening?" All Naruto got in response was a faint snoring coming from the back of his mind. Cursing the fox under his breath, Naruto focused back on what was in front of him. It turned out that it was Orika, who had leaned in and was about to tap him in the forehead just to annoy him. rather like a certain raven-haired older brother to the village's resident emo. Somewhere deep in the woods, Itachi Uchiha sneezed violently, prompting a "bless you" from his shark-like companion in the matching cloak. Naruto was rather startled by the sight of his sensei, who was a rather beautiful woman after all, only inches away from his face, so he backed up a few inches. "What were you doing there, sensei?" he asked, a faint pink tinge dusting his cheeks. Orika blinked innocently. "You spaced out," she remarked. "Fuzzball wanted to chat," Naruto replied, jabbing a thumb towards where the seal on his midsection was. Orika nodded in understanding, having actually paused conversations with others herself to ponder about some random research project that crossed her mind. There were times that she wished that she was a Jinchuriki herself so she could understand what it was like to always have a creature of incomparable destruction sealed within them and always commenting from the back of their mind. It always intrigued her, and she almost envied the Jinchuriki for their power and constant partner. Of course, this desire of hers was purely for research. At least, that was her story, and she was sticking by it. She sighed internally. Then again, who needed to be a Jinchuriki to research what it was like when your favorite apprentice happened to be one? Orika opened her mouth to ask about what exactly the fox wanted to talk about when Naruto held up a hand for a second, his eyes darting from side to side as he listened intently. Orika licked her lips in anticipation, several snakes subtly slithering from her sleeve. Naruto put a hand back on his sword, still listening. Silence reigned for several minutes. A screaming war cry echoed through the training ground as a silver-haired man leapt from one of the trees at the edge of the field, bringing his tri-bladed scythe down like the blade of a guillotine. Both Naruto and Orika darted backwards to avoid the blow. Orika grinned before thrusting her arm out. Seneashu, hidden shadow snake hands. A half-dozen brown snakes launched out from her sleeve, hissing in fury. The silver-haired scythe wielder yanked his weapon out of the round and backflipped away from approaching serpents, laughing madly all the while. He quickly held up his scythe again to block a lunging strike from the robe-clad blonde. Naruto's face twitched under the hood, before he launched into a flurry of strikes. His opponent grinned maniacally as he kept blocking each strike with either the blades of his scythe or the shaft of the handle itself. Naruto, getting rather annoyed with the constant blocking, went for an unexpected approach. Naruto flipped his sword into a reverse grip, and slammed the pommel right between the man's legs. The silver-haired man froze for a moment, before the pain finally sunk in. Then the obscenities flowed. "Holy mother of Jashin, that fucking hurts." He quickly fell to his knees, the scythe forgotten as he held his crotch in his hands. Naruto backed up a bit, sword still at the ready. Orika fought the urge to laugh as she pulled the kusanagi blade out of her mouth. Naruto eyed the man for a moment. "Who are you? Why have you come here?" The man didn't respond. "Holy shit, that hurt," he groaned, still clutching his crotch. Naruto scowled. "I said, who are you?" he growled. The silver-haired man seemed to get over his excruciating pain as he shakily got to his feet, scythe once again in hand. "Man, you really are a piece of work, aren't you, kid?" he remarked, a grin once again on his face. "I haven't been kicked there in years." He laughed for a second before swinging his scythe in a circle, landing on his shoulder. He slicked back his mussed-up hair and grinned at Naruto like the psycho he was. "The name's Hidan, follower of the great god Jashin. And it's my time to test you and see if you're actually worthy to be Jashin's harbinger." Naruto was a bit surprised, not only by Hidan's outburst, but by the fact that the fox seemed to stir from within the seal. Almost like he recognized the name, Jashin, in some form or fashion. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked. "Are you serious?" Hidan remarked, disbelief evident on his face. "You bear the robes of one of the nine harbingers of the coming of the great Lord Jashin." Hidan grinned madly. "And based on what I saw already from your fight with the Sannin earlier, you hold the power of the greatest of them. The Witch King." Naruto tilted his head, cracking his neck loudly. "So, you're here to test me then," he said with a smirk. "In that case, let's get right to it then. That's the spirit." Hidan darted forward, slashing wildly with his scythe. Naruto ducked under the swings, and stabbed forward. Hidan took the blow to the stomach with a grin as he headbutted the young wraith, causing him to lose grip of the sword and leave it lodged in Hidan's midsection. Naruto's eyes narrowed. "What the hell? That won't kill me. I'm immortal for a reason. Hidan bellowed, whipping his scythe to the side. It was then that Naruto noticed the long gray cable attached to the end of the scythe's handle. Hidan lashed out with the scythe like a whip, the bladed object flying inches from Naruto's head and coming right back as Hidan yanked the cable. Naruto jumped over the scythe and yanked his sword free from Hidan's body. Orika on the other hand morphed her lower body into a snake's tail and slithered forward with the kusanagi in hand. Swift as a serpent, she lunged at the Jushinist. Hidan jumped over her attack, only to land and block a blow from each of his opponents with his scythe. Laughing once again, Hidan jumped over the Sannin and the Wraith, still grinning. Dashing towards Naruto, scythe swinging haphazardly, Hidan's blade was deflected by Naruto's gauntlets. Naruto clenched his hand into a fist as his gauntlet began to glow an ominous light blue color. Wraith stun. Naruto slammed his fist into Hidan's midsection, firing off a wave of the translucent blue energy that quickly left the Jushinist quite dazed. Naruto followed up with a flurry of slashes, each followed by the ethereal wraith-like form copying the previous attack, culminating in a combined slash that sent the silver-haired man flying. Hidan, unfazed, cackled as he recklessly charged forward again. Naruto grinned under his hood, as the curse mark on his shoulder activated and the chain-shaped markings formed on the right side of his face. Naruto raised a fist as a translucent form of a wraith formed over his body, only this time the color was a much darker blue. Wraith flash, Naruto hissed. Then he brought his fist down. A shockwave of dark blue energy blasted out from where Naruto's fist struck the ground, sending Hidan flying once again, as well as briefly staggering Orika. Orika quickly recovered and darted towards Hidan, throwing the kusanagi like a javelin. Hidan managed to duck the flying blade, only for Naruto to appear in a swirl of shadows right alongside the sword. The Jushinist turned in surprise only to meet the kusanagi in the chest. Before he could react any further, Naruto gripped his longsword in both hands and swung. And with that, Hidan's severed head fell to the ground. Naruto huffed for a moment before ripping the kusanagi out of Hidan's headless corpse and tossing it to Orika, who swallowed it a second later. Sheathing his sword, Naruto turned to walk away. Damn it, that hurt. Naruto turned around quickly. Much to his shock, the severed head was still alive and swearing up a storm. How are you still alive after that? I already told you. I'm immortal. Orika looked down at the head, suddenly remembering something. She smirked, almost like a snake about to devour a mouse. It's been a while, hasn't it, Hidan? She mused. Hidan's head raised an eyebrow before looking closely at the Sannin. Something sparked in his memories. Oh great, it's the crazy snake bitch, he groaned. Orika's smile immediately turned malicious. Several snakes began slithering from her sleeves as an ungodly key filled the area. What was that, Hidan? She hissed in a sickly sweet tone, her eyes flashing dangerously. Judging by the look on Hidan's face, he probably would have lost control of something if he was still attached to his body. I mean, what's up, Orika? He asked in a high-pitched tone. Naruto shook his head at his sensei's actions. She wasn't called psycho for nothing. She just really disliked the term Hidan used to describe her. At least she wasn't threatening to dissect the poor immortal. He reached down, and despite the protests, lifted up Hidan's head by the hair. Why did you attack us? It was a test, Hidan replied. I already told you that you bear the robes of the greatest of Jashin's harbingers, so I had to test you to see if you were actually worthy to bear the mantle. He glanced to the side towards his headless body. And judging by the fact that I'm pretty much beaten at the moment, I'd say you passed the test, he noted dryly. What do you mean harbingers of Jashin? Naruto asked. Hidan rolled his eyes. Jashin was the one who created them in the first place. To be the bringers of his will. And as his servant, I also carry out his will as should you. Naruto was about to retort angrily. He was nobody's servant, or so he thought, when he caught a feeling of amusement from the fox. Amusement. The fox was silent throughout the entire test, from Hidan, which was odd since he was usually commenting and yelling out advice during most of Naruto's battles. And Naruto knew that Kurama had been awake the entire time, due to the stirring he felt when Hidan mentioned Jashin. Naruto looked down to his midsection before looking back at Orika. Do you have any hideouts in the area? Maybe. Why? Take Hidan back to the closest one and see what you can do to reattach him to his body. "I've got something I need to do," he replied. With that, he tossed Hidan's head to Orika, ignoring the profanities flying his direction, and walked out of the training ground, his Nazgul robes and an armor fading away in a flash of shadows and green-tinged black energy. He had a fox to interrogate. Mindscape. Later that night, Naruto was at the moment at a loss for words. When he fell asleep on his couch with the intention of confronting Kurama, he wasn't expecting the fox to pull him directly into the mindscape. Naruto's mindscape had changed drastically from what he normally saw. Normally it appeared to be a sewer with copious amounts of water everywhere, with pipes lining the walls and all around just looked terrible to look at. Instead of a sewer, it appeared to be a hallway. Though it wasn't any normal hallway. It was much longer than Naruto remembered, and instead of the pitted iron walls he knew it was smooth black marble. Torches lit the area with a strange aquamarine-colored fire, bathing the area in color that reflected off of the polished black stone. The ground was no longer covered in a foot of water and instead had a blood-red silk carpet lining the floor. Naruto, still pondering the change yet still wanting to question Kurama, merely ignored the scenery and pushed ahead. He eventually came to a large pair of pure onyx doors. What unnerved him a bit was the fact that the doors were embossed in red with the symbol of a gigantic eye with a slit pupil. Steeling himself, Naruto kicked the doors open. Much to his shock once again, was the changed SC energy of the room Kurama normally was caged in. The cage itself was gone, as was the fox himself. The room that had been Kurama's prison was now an elaborate throne room, one befitting of a being of darkness. Black and red carpets covered the floor, banners in black once again marked with the symbol of an eye in red, blood-red stained glass windows. It was all beautiful and terrifying at the same time. What caught Naruto's attention were two specific things. One was the twin statues of a giant in armor, wielding a humongous mace. The spiked helmets on the heads glared down at Naruto, almost watching him. All in all, the statues were definitely creepy, and yet they seemed to have some sort of power, almost like Naruto couldn't look away. The second thing was the spiky ebony throne in the center of the room. But it wasn't really the throne that caught his attention. What really caught his attention was the figure sitting in the throne itself. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its legs crossed leisurely as it lounged on the throne. No features could be seen of the figure. Nothing except two fiery eyes with slit pupils. Naruto steeled himself and asked a single question that would change everything as he knew it. Even though he didn't know this yet. "Who are you?" A toothy grin was all that he got in response. Naruto was staring at the throne before him. The shadows finally parted to reveal the figure lounging there watching Naruto with a pair of crimson eyes with slit pupils. In all honesty, Naruto was expecting a demonic figure befitting of the humanoid form of the nine-tailed fox in all his glory. But what he got was something much different from what he initially visualized. Not to be chauvinistic or anything, but Naruto was expecting the fox to be male when in a human form. She was practically a goddess given human form. Well, a war goddess that is. She had flawless porcelain skin pale as snow, contrasting with the raven hair flowing down her back and over one shoulder. A bang of hair slightly covered one eye and the left side of her face, her vermilion eyes gleaming with amusement, a slight smirk gracing her features. Naruto almost got the feeling that she was looking at him like an owner would a dog that just did an entertaining trick. She was clad in steel armor tinted in black, formed out of multiple overlapping plates to form an intricately beautiful yet terrifying image. Pitch black chain mail cloaked her form underneath the armor. Spikes jutted from the shoulders and the gauntlets of the armor, while her uncovered hands bore fingernails painted a shade of onyx that were sharpened and honed to the point that they resembled claws. A ragged black cape hung from her shoulders and draped behind her on the throne. Her lips were coated in blood-red lipstick, and from what little Naruto could see of her form due to the armor coating it, her arms and legs were toned from what could have been years of combat. A part of Naruto, despite all attempts to squash it after gaining it unwillingly from Hitaki, noted that her chest was rather large if the shape of the armor was anything to go by. A helmet sat at the foot of her throne, and it was even more menacing than the helm of the Witch King that Naruto himself had found in the Forest of Death. Like the armor she wore, the helmet was made of black-tinted steel, with a crown of spikes stabbing upward from the top of the helmet. The faceplate formed to look like that of a skull, though lacking a lower jaw. On the other side of the throne was a gigantic spiked mace, looking to be almost large enough to come up to Naruto's shoulders. She smirked and stood, giving Naruto a bit of a start when he saw something he hadn't noticed while she was sitting. She was inhumanly tall, almost around 7 or 8 feet if Naruto's guess was anything. She stepped down the stairs from the throne before stopping halfway down. Her crimson eyes flashed a golden orange for a split second as she settled her gaze upon Naruto. "And so we meet again, Naruto," she remarked, her voice rich and deep with a minor tone of amusement. Naruto narrowed his eyes, his purple Sharingan flashing for a second before fading back to blue. "Kurama?" She laughed, a calming yet slightly unnerving laugh that chilled Naruto to the bone. She grinned, revealing her elongated canines. "Really? Don't you recognize me in this form, Naruto?" she asked, her voice morphing to the familiar dark and growling tone of the nine-tailed fox. Naruto's eyes widened for a bit before settling back to their narrowed position. "Why exactly are you in this form, Kurama?" "Kurama," the woman mused. "He was merely a pseudonym. A recreated identity. The Kurama you knew never truly existed. All that remains is me." "Well, if you're not Kurama, then who the hell are you?" Naruto asked indignantly, a bit put off at the fact that this woman had pretended to be a friend and slightly angered that one of his few friends was actually a false identity. The woman smiled and spread her arms out to her sides, her eyes flashing golden orange once again. "I am the Shadow of the East, the necromancer of Dal Guldur, the proclaimed enemy of the people of Middle-earth, the ruler of Mordor, the Great Eye, the Lord of Gifts, the Lord of Barad-dûr, and the successor of Morgoth," she proclaimed, a wide grin on her face as her eyes flashed with mirth, and almost what appeared to be a hint of madness. "I am Sauron, the true Lord of the Rings." Sauron lowered her hands back down to her sides as she glanced at Naruto, whose form was now clad in the robes of the Nazgul. "And, I am the creator of your predecessor." Naruto backed up a bit, his hand wandering to the sword sheathed at his side. Sauron scoffed and raised a hand and moved it forward. Her hand was stopped by the sudden appearance of a barrier of white lightning, which quickly disappeared when she moved her hand away. "You don't have to bother with that," she said, nodding to the sword. "It's not like I can do anything despite assuming my true form, for I am still locked behind this seal. Even though I am not what the caster intended to seal, the Shikifu Jin, dead demon-consuming seal, is still powered by a divine being and therefore can still hold me back." She smirked, lowered her eyelids slightly as she gazed at her host. "I don't suppose you could be persuaded to undo the seal, would you? Naruto-kun?" she said condescendingly. Naruto backed up a little more, fighting the blush that wanted to form, while Sauron laughed cruelly. She turned around, sweeping her black cloak behind her as she made her way up the stairs to sit upon the throne once more. Naruto managed to shake himself out of his stupor before gazing at the form of the Dark Lord, or Dark Lady, whatever the title was now, lounging across her throne, her eyes still alight with amusement as she stared at the mortal who doubled as her jail. He twitched a moment, his fingers twitching as if wishing there was a blade clutched in his hand. "To answer your question about releasing you, I've given you that answer plenty of times when you were Kurama." "Hell, no." Sauron chuckled to herself before staring back at Naruto. "How many times do I have to tell you? Kurama did not exist," she replied with a smirk. She then put a finger on her chin for a moment and pondered for a second. "Well, actually he did exist at one point, but if there's anything left of his personality after I assimilated myself into him, then he would be much different from the facade of Kurama that I created myself." Naruto was a little taken aback. Kurama, the irritable, sarcastic, bloodthirsty fox, was just a mask? Sure, Kurama and Naruto hadn't always gotten along all the time, the curse mark incident during the preliminaries being one. The fox had been all that Naruto had at times. Sure, there was Danzo-sensei and Orika, but they weren't always there. Orika was usually off experimenting or tormenting some poor sot in the middle of Kami knows where, while Danzo was usually arguing with Hiruzen and the councils about some stupid little piece of politics that the civilians were trying to pull. If he wasn't doing that, then Danzo was usually lurking in the shadows with Root. Naruto and Kurama never saw eye to eye on many things, but Naruto still felt that he and the fox had some twisted form of friendship regardless. To hear that one of the few beings he called a friend was an illusion was a hard pill to swallow. Naruto lowered his head, his gauntlet-covered fists clenching tightly at his side. Sauron gazed at Naruto, watching with amusement as his hair lost the multicolored tints running through it and the sun-yellow locks began to pale ever so slightly. For a split second, she almost thought that it had lengthened by an inch at the back of his neck. The seal around the curse mark cracked slightly as black chain-shaped tattoos spread over the right side of his face. How much of it was a lie? Sauron arched an eyebrow, the smirk fading from her face as Naruto advanced towards the barrier separating them. "What do you mean by that?" she replied. Naruto's eyes quickly morphed into his Sharingan, which flickered between the usual purple iris with black tomo to a different color scheme. It almost reminded Sauron of an inverted Sharingan of a normal Uchiha, with a black iris and twin blood-red tomo and pupil. If Kurama was a lie, Naruto growled, then was that friendship also a lie? The bickering, the agreements, all those nights where I was reassured by Kurama that I would never be alone whenever I confided in him with my fears and anxieties? How much of that was a goddamn lie? By now a foul dark chakra was radiating from Naruto's body, a mixture of purple and a very light, almost translucent green. As his rage began to peak even more, the tattoos from the curse mark were now completely covering his face. Sauron stood and walked down the stairs once more to stand in front of the barrier standing between her and her host. "I can only say this, Naruto Uzumaki," she said in a low voice. "I never lied about our supposed friendship. Of course, it is a much different circumstance now, but that no longer matters. For now you need to push past this." Naruto's flickering Sharingan narrowed. "What do you mean by that?" he snarled. Sauron gave a shark-like grin as her eyes burned a darker shade of red, her pupils dilating into slits and her sclera darkening to black with glowing red veins, while black veins began to extend out from her eyes onto her face. Orange flames began coiling off of her being as her armor heated up slowly to match the color of the fire rolling off of her. With that, she clicked her fingers. Naruto was instantly flung back from the shockwave, landing back at the bottom of the staircase. Scrambling back up into a sitting position, Naruto's eyes widened, as the image on the stairs was forever copied to his memories thanks to his still active Sharingan. Soren's helmet had materialized on her head, completing the beautiful yet terrifying image of a true goddess of darkness and destruction. Her armor burned black once more as flames shot out from every part of her body, quickly forming the image of an enormous fiery eye with a pitch-black slit pupil. A part of Naruto, much to his surprise, was filled with awe and submission. "You have grown weak and complacent, my little jailer. And I will not have a weak container, regardless of my feelings on being sealed in the first place." Naruto involuntarily flinched, lowering his head to avoid looking directly at the gigantic demonic eye. Kurama had never truly frightened him per se, except the one jump scare via shoving his claws through the bars of the cage with them stopping less than an inch from Naruto's face, but now he was experiencing fear that he had never felt before. Something about Soren's presence simply inspired terror. The flames making up the shape of the eyes suddenly dispersed as quickly as they had come, leaving behind Sauron in her usual form, sans helmet once more. "And while you may be somewhat strong by human standards," Sauron told him, "by the standards of your predecessor, you are weak." Naruto glared angrily from the floor. "I put on the damn helmet, didn't I? So I should have the power of the Witch King, right?" he growled. Sauron let out a cruel laugh once again, her fiery eyes boring into Naruto's very being, her face betraying her amusement. "You believe that just by wearing a helmet that your predecessor only wore at truly important battles would give you his complete power? And I thought that warped halfling who stole my ring was stupid." Naruto's eyes widened. The helmet wasn't the symbol of the feared lord of the Nazgul? If that was the case, then how did he even gain any power from it? "I can tell what you're thinking," Sauron remarked. "The reason you gained any power at all was because some of the Witch King's soul energy rubbed off on it, same as if you had found his gauntlet or sword. So by putting it on, you were able to awaken that little sliver of power, small though it is. And as you can tell, even in its weakened state, the soul-infused energy of a Nazgul is very potent." Naruto's head lowered for a moment, pondering this new information. If the helmet had only given him a small amount of power, then how would he regain all of it? If he was to be the Witch King, then he was going to need all the power of the original. Sauron couldn't help but smirk when she heard Naruto's next question. How'd I gain the full power then? Sauron chuckled darkly. She leaned forward to look down at her container, who almost looked to be kneeling before her, at least in her eyes he was. I will not lie, she told him. By the time this month is over, you'll be wishing I was just an Uruk trainer. Naruto fought the urge to shiver at the sight of her bloodthirsty grin. 1 month later, Chunin exam finals. It was the moment that all of Konoha, and guests, had been patiently, and impatiently, waiting for the last month. The Chunin exam finals. Not surprisingly, a good portion of Konoha was all for seeing two specific things today. One was the power of the last Uchiha, whom they all idolized just for what happened to his clan. The second thing was the fight against the demon brat, and the prodigy of the Hyuga. Just about everyone wanted to see Naruto on the ground at the feet of a powerful member of one of their most noble clans. Yet at the same time, some of the Naruto haters were a little concerned for Neji Hyuga. Should Naruto access the Kyuubi's power again, Neji might end up having a hard time of thrashing the blonde. Another portion of Konoha, which was much smaller than the other part of the village, was not prejudiced against Naruto per se, but still felt that he wouldn't stand a chance against Neji. Sakura herself, while obviously rooting for Sasuke, still was concerned with the fact that Naruto was going up against another prodigy. And while he had been an idiot most of the time, he was still her teammate. The surrounding Jonin, especially the former student of a certain snake summoner, were all on guard in the event that Naruto or Sasuke decided to tap into the curse mark during their matches. And the smallest portion of all, was those who actually believed that Naruto would easily win. As of now it was limited to about 3 people. Hinata Hyuga, the Sandaime Hokage, and the one silver-haired man sitting in the front row with a hooded cloak shrouding his features and the maniacal grin on his face. But whatever the side they supported, no one could deny that this Chunin exams would be very interesting. The Sandaime Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, was concerned for the village. Given the reports that not only was Orika in the area, as evidenced by the curse marks on Naruto and Sasuke, but evidence also pointed to a Jashinist being in the area if the Jashinist symbol on the ground next to recently killed victims was anything to go by. And with the cult of Jashin basically in shambles, there was only one person who could possibly fit the moe of the killings. Hiruzen suppressed the urge to groan at the implications. If Hidan of the Bloody Scythe was in Konoha, then he feared for her people. He also made a mental note to schedule a meeting with Danzo at some point to up their security. If 2 S-class criminals could sneak into a hidden village in the same time frame, then said village had gotten very lax in their time of peace. He was shaken out of his thoughts with the arrival of the 2 visiting cages, the Yondaime Case Cage, an auburn-haired man by the name of Rasa, and the Shodem Otokage, a pretty black-haired woman with honey-colored eyes by the name of Kira. Lord Hiruzen, Rasa said with a nod towards the elder cage. Kira merely gave a serene smile and bowed her head slightly towards Hiruzen. The Sandaime Hokage couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at her. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about her seemed horribly familiar. Seconds later the booth was occupied by one other person, the spymaster and self-proclaimed super pervert of Konoha, as well as the only male member of the Sannin, and the only loyal one too, Jiraiya of Mount Myoboku. Sensei, he greeted with a grin. Jiraiya, Hiruzen replied. Rasa glanced over at Jiraiya, and his eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't expected the Toad Sennin to make an appearance. Inwardly, he began running through various scenarios in his head, calculating to himself how different today's outcome could be with Jiraiya in the equation. Kira on the other hand showed no other visible change in expression, other than her eyes flashing snake-like pupils for half a second. Hiruzen glanced at Jiraiya, raising an eyebrow slightly. Jiraiya only gave an almost undetectable nod. I trust that these matches will hold some excitement today, right Lord Hokage? The Otokage asked, her musical voice immediately causing Jiraiya to look over at her and start staring at her figure. Of course it will be exiting, Rasa retorted. After all, my children made it to finals. And I can guarantee that the battle between Sasuke Uchiha and Gaara will be one to be remembered. Hiruzen nodded, while inwardly reviewing the knowledge they had gotten so far. If he was right, something was definitely going to happen when Sasuke and Gaara's match arrived. Hiruzen sighed inwardly. I'm too old for this shit, he thought ruefully. With Naruto standing in front of the entrance to the center of the arena, Naruto kept his face in a mask of cold indifference. Naruto had drastically improved over the course of the month while training. Not just with Sauron, but Orika and Danzo as well. Each of them had worked with him in a specific subject, Kenjutsu and controlling the curse mark from Orika, more jutsu and subterfuge from Danzo, and in the case of Sauron, needless to say she had lived up to her promise of making Naruto's life hell during their training. Wraith techniques, manipulation, sorcery, even a few poisons, nothing was held back. Naruto had not escaped his training without physical change. Over time, his appearance was altered even more as he continued to channel soul energy during his training with Sauron. The multicolored highlights in his hair had vanished permanently, and his hair had flattened down. His hair was now a pale blonde color, and now had reached his back in length. With his hair no longer a mess of untamable spikes, Naruto had slicked it back and tied it into a ponytail. His face was more angular, and his whisker marks had lessened in the thickness that they had had before. His clothing was no longer what would be considered appropriate shinobi attire by most members of the Konoha shinobi forces. Gone was the Anbu-style clothing that he had worn last month, instead was something much different. Naruto was cloaked in the billowy black robes of a Nazgul, with armor covering his lower body and gauntlets on his arms. Sheathed at his side was his broadsword, and within the robes a hilt of a smaller blade was seen. A hilt with a curved guard lined with spikes. His hood was not shrouding his face, and he was set with a calm emotionless expression that would leave Danzo shedding tears of pride at the sight of it. Naruto stood there, contemplating. He knew of what Orika was planning, the only thing was that he didn't know what his role was. Was he to keep his cover and hide his true feelings towards his home? Or would he actively aid Orika and finally break free from Konoha's shackles? A hand on his shoulder broke his concentration as he turned to look at the person trying to get his attention. Kabuto smiled at Naruto, gently pushing up the round glasses lying across the bridge of her nose. Her silver hair was held back in a ponytail, and she dressed in the garb of an Anbu with a cloak over her body. Kabuto, Naruto remarked. Naruto, Kabuto replied. What are you doing here? I figured you'd already be on assignment. Kabuto smirked. I can't wish my fellow apprentice some luck or anything, she teased. Funny, if that were the case then wouldn't Mitarashi be wishing me luck? He retorted. Kabuto chuckled before pulling Naruto into a hug, despite the armor he wore. Go give him hell Naruto, she whispered in his ear. She pulled away, putting on the porcelain animal mask and pulling up her hood before disappearing in a shunshin. Naruto glanced down at his hand and unfolded the paper Kabuto had slipped into his grip when she hugged him. Reading over the contents, Naruto smirked lightly before igniting it in a small burst of wraith fire and letting the paper disperse into light green ashes. Seems there's something between you and your sensei, Naruto? Sauron teased from the back of his mind. What am I supposed to think about that? Naruto ignored the dark entity sealed within him in favor of walking out onto the field and standing in the line with the rest of the participants, minus the one sound Genin and Sasuke. Everybody immediately did a double take at the sight of the blonde and his new appearance. Some in the audience, Neji's teammates, were now a bit more concerned for Neji. Hinata was also worried for her cousin, and it was clear on her face. Even Hiyashi Hyuga, the stoic head of the Hyuga clan, was slightly worried, though it didn't show on his face. Up on top of the roof of the arena, a pale-skinned boy wearing all black and a shirt that exposed his midsection watched with interest. Clutched in his hands was what appeared to be something similar to the Hokage's crystal ball. Far away in an underground bunker, Danzo Shimura watched through the ball with interest, though slightly irritated that Naruto was apparently going to reveal some of his new powers. Genma, the new proctor, looked at the line of Genin and called forth the first fight of the day. Naruto Uzumaki vs Neji Hyuga. Neji strode forward with all the arrogance of a Hyuga, despite being a member of the branch family of the Hyuga. Naruto on the other hand almost seemed to glide towards his opponent, his new features giving him an equally aristocratic appearance. Genma stepped back towards the edge of the field, almost eager to step out of the firing range of the Hyuga and the Jinchuriki. It was then that Neji spoke. Give up. Naruto raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? He said in a low voice. I said give up, Neji told him. You who are nothing but a commoner, fated to be trash for all your existence, have no chance at beating an elite of one of Konoha's most noble clans. Naruto's eyes narrowed, his irises flickering pale green for a split second as he took in the sight of the so-called prodigy of the Hyuga. That's funny, Naruto remarked. You claim to be an elite of the Hyuga, yet you do not count as an elite. You are a member of the branch family, and you bear that disgusting mark on your forehead. Given the branch's status as little more than servants, you have no right to be called an elite of a noble clan. Neji's eyes blazed as the veins bulged around the sides of his face as his Byakugan activated out of sheer rage. A slave of a noble clan is still better than that of a nobody. A dead last who barely passed the academy. It is your fate to lose, he snarled. Naruto couldn't hold it in anymore as he began laughing at what Neji had just said. He held out his hand and in a burst of pale green fire a weapon appeared. It was a flail, a gigantic flail that looked to be as tall as Naruto himself, with the head of the weapon covered in spikes and looking like someone had stuck a metal boulder on the end of a chain and attached it to a staff. Perhaps you are right about one thing, Neji. Perhaps fate is real, but I know that my fate is not to lose. The question is, what will be your fate at the end of this battle, Neji? Naruto asked. Will you come out on top and defeat me? Or will you die in the heat of glorious battle? Will you fight my fate, and therefore yours, or will you accept it? Neji was a bit shocked at the proclamation of the blonde. He shook off his shock and settled into the signature taijutsu style of the Hyuga clan. The Jukin, also known as the gentle fist. Then come trash, Neji drawled. Let us see what fate will lead us to. Naruto chuckled darkly before settling into a battle stance with his mace held at the ready, swiftly unsheathing his sword in his other hand. Hajime! Genma yelled from the sidelines before quickly leaving the arena. He really didn't want to get hit in the crossfire from that mace. Neji shot towards Naruto, fingertips blazing in an attempt to strike quick and hard, hoping to end the match in one strike. Naruto batted aside the offending limb with the flat of his sword and swung downward with the flail. Neji was only barely able to escape the crushing blow from the weapon that left a crater in the earth. Eyeing the weapon warily, Neji got back into his stance and watched carefully. Naruto smirked before stabbing his sword in the ground and letting his weapon disappear in another flash of green fire. How about we even up the odds then, Hyuga, he remarked. Neji's eye twitched at the comment. Yet a part of him was slightly cautious. A supposed loser was able to not only deflect his strike, but also put him in a position where it was dodge or get crushed. Now Naruto was ridding himself of his main weapons and speaking of evening the odds. Did he mean to challenge him in taijutsu? Now normally challenging a Hyuga in full-on taijutsu was suicide. But given the speed of his opponent from what he had seen, not to mention good reflexes as well, a taijutsu fight might not be so suicidal after all. Neji narrowed his eyes. Naruto's chakra network was laid bare for him to see, and it was rather strange to him. First was the color of his normal chakra. Instead of the usual light blue chakra running through his coils, instead the chakra almost seemed to be a slightly darker shade. Almost like a true blue instead of sky blue. Secondly was the concentration of dark purple chakra located on the side of Naruto's neck. Could that have something to do with the markings on his face when he fought the Inuzuka? And what was that seal matrix on his navel? You really shouldn't start daydreaming like that, Hyuga, Naruto's voice whispered from his left. It's liable to get you killed. Neji turned in shock only to receive a gauntlet-coated fist to the face. He tumbled across the ground before flipping back to a standing position. Naruto stood there, his fists held in front of his face, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. Neji wiped his mouth, smearing away the small trickle of blood left from Naruto's armor. Having neglected to keep the armor in mind, Neji was now paying the price for underestimating Naruto's hand-to-hand combat. Naruto spun and disappeared in a swirl of shadow. Neji detected his reappearance to his right and lashed out with a palm strike that impacted against Naruto's gauntlet. Naruto dropped down and attempted to kick Neji's feet out from under him. He almost succeeded, if it weren't for the Hyuga's damnable eyes. Neji shot out another strike, fingers blazing with chakra once more, only for Naruto to teleport behind him in another swirl of shadows and kick him in the back. Neji stood up from the blow, wondering how Naruto had managed to escape his vision. The Byakugan was inescapable. No one could evade its sight. Well, It appears I managed to find it after all. Neji's eyebrows rose in shock. Find what? Naruto gave a smirk as he pointed to the back of his own head. Neji was thoroughly confused until Naruto spoke again. And his words chilled the blood of every Hyuga in the stadium. Why the one weakness of the Byakugan? That tiny little blind spot right at the back of your head. I've done my research after all, like any good shinobi who wishes to defeat his opponent, wouldn't you say? Hiyashi Hyuga couldn't believe his ears. Was the weakness in the Byakugan so well known that anyone could find out about it? Or was Naruto much more skilled at information gathering than he had thought? Neji himself was horrified. The fabled Byakugan had a blind spot? How was this possible? Any thoughts that would have came after that were immediately shattered as Naruto began his barrage of strikes, all aimed right at Neji's blind spot. Teleport, punch to the back of the head. Teleport, sweeping kick to the knees and an uppercut to send Neji into the air. Teleport, diving kick to the back of his spine to drive him back into the ground. An endless spree of punches and kicks, all extremely difficult to block and hurting like hell with the extra coating of metal enhancing them. In a desperate attempt to actually injure the blonde, Neji staggered to his feet and threw an old-fashioned punch. No style, no jukin, just brawling. Naruto responded by grabbing Neji's arm by the wrist before kicking his opponent in the neck and pulling hard while pushing with his foot. Neji coughed up blood and squirmed frantically to escape Naruto's grip. So tell me, Neji, do you wish to die slow or fast? Your choice, Naruto said with a smirk. Gasping for air, Neji did the only thing he could do. Drop a smoke bomb and get the hell out. Both fighters shot out from opposite ends of the smoke cloud, one coughing and sucking in as much air as possible, the other landing beside the sword he stabbed into the ground earlier. Growling in irritation, Naruto yanked his sword out of the ground and raised it high. He opened his mouth and let loose a shrill shriek that almost burst the eardrums of everyone in the stadium. The blade of his sword ignited in pale green fire before Naruto grasped the hilt in both hands and swung. A shockwave of pale green fire rocketed from the sword, tearing a gash in the ground as it shot towards the recovering Hyuga. Neji got himself into a shaky stance and activated his technique. Hakesho Kaden, 8 trigrams palms revolving heaven. Neji was immediately surrounded by a swirling mass of chakra as he spun, only barely deflecting the wave of fire. Neji spun himself out, before getting back into a stance, seeming to have gotten his second wind. You may have gotten the drop on me this time, Neji told Naruto. But this next technique will end the match here and now. Naruto smirked. If that's the case, then show me this technique then, he called out as he summoned his flail in a flash of green fire. Neji's face contorted in rage as he shot forward, fingertips blazing as he ducked under Naruto's guard. Hake Rukuyon Sho. 8 trigrams 64 palms. With that, Neji began his onslaught of strikes, much to the awe of the Hyuga clan members in the audience at seeing a branch family member use not one but 2 techniques that belonged to the main family exclusively. Even more shocking was that Neji was finally hitting the demon brat after being dominated for the entire match. 2 palms, 4 palms, 8 palms, 16 palms, 32 palms, Hake Rukuyon Sho, he bellowed as he landed the last set of strikes. Naruto slid back a few feet, standing motionless before lifting his head and staring at the Hyuga. Funny, he mused, that's a main family technique. Now why would a branch member know anything like that? Neji glared at him, Byakugan still blazing. As far as he could tell, the blonde's tenketsu were still closed after his last attack. Yet why was he so calm? For one who believes that it is his fate to be a servant to the main family, you hold yourself in high regard, Naruto continued. For a branch member to learn the techniques of the main, if you were fated to be a servant, then why would you bother to learn techniques that you had no right to learn? Neji's face contorted in rage. What the hell are you implying? He growled. Naruto's smirk got a little bigger. Why, I'm just saying that for someone who says one should not fight fate, you sure have done a good job of defying it by learning abilities you should have been fated to never be able to use, he remarked. And there's also the fact that you believed that such a technique could stop me anyways. Neji's eyes widened as Naruto's chakra began to burn the same light green color as the flames from before, his new chakra forcibly opening his closed tenketsu. A faint light green aura appeared around Naruto as his irises flickered the same color. Neji shook himself out of his shock and shot towards Naruto with the intent to close off his tenketsu once more, only for his strike to be blocked by Naruto's armor on his arms. Naruto grinned evilly as Neji realized the truth. You see, for the Jukin to work the user must inject their chakra into an enemy's network, Naruto drawled. But what happens if your enemy is wearing armor? His grin got wider. The Jukin has become completely useless. Neji's eyes widened in horror before he backed up to dodge the slash from Naruto's sword. Naruto began whipping the flail around behind him while slashing at the Hyuga prodigy in a manner akin to both a berserker and a master swordsman. Wild and unpredictable, yet calm and precise. After getting several minor slashes across the chest, Neji finally drew a kunai to block the sword's next blow. Naruto only grinned wider. That was when he brought the head of the flail down on Neji's hand in a shattering blow. Neji screamed in pain as he dropped his kunai, the pain of his crushed and dislocated hand burning through his nervous system. Naruto raised his sword again. Neji, with little options left, had no choice but to block the strikes with his forearm. By the time blood had begun to spill onto the arena floor, Naruto slammed the flail into Neji's Achilles tendon, bringing the prodigy to his knees. Naruto banished his flail with a flare of green fire and sheathed his sword. He then hit Neji with a vicious haymaker to the face, causing him to spit out a tooth and plenty of blood. The crowd was silent, horrified by this sudden turn of events. Some of the civilians were even on the verge of either passing out or vomiting at the sight of the badly beaten Hyuga. Hinata was shocked, but inwardly praying that her, Naruto-kun, would show mercy and spare her cousin. At that point, a certain Sannin disguised as a cage, as well as a female entity of darkness suddenly felt the urge to brutally murder some poor shy little girl. A specific silver-haired man in a cloak gave a bloodthirsty grin at the sight, and raised his pentacle to pray silently to his god, or rather, goddess. Naruto stared down at his opponent, impassive and uncaring as he turned to walk away from the beaten Hyuga. Naruto, you're really not going to let him live now, are you? Lady Sauron, sometimes we don't have to murder everything. That is true, but don't you realize what he did to his cousin? His own flesh and blood? Sauron crooned in Naruto's head. Who's to say he won't do it again? No, he must be stopped, permanently. Naruto paused in his path as Neji began to speak through his pain. So, you're not going to finish it then? He coughed out. You're a coward and a failure. And you will always be. Fate has decreed it. Naruto's rage began to peak. He would dare to call him, the successor of the Witch King, the most trusted servant of Sauron, weak? Sauron then took the opportunity to whisper in his ear once more. He dares to call you, my chosen one, weak? End him. Honor demands it. Justice demands it. With a shrieking war cry, Naruto unsheathed the blade at his waist, revealing a blade with a sickly, evil aura about it. He teleported right in front of Neji and drove the blade through his neck. And just while Neji began to choke on his own blood, Naruto whispered in his ear. Seems your fate was to die after all, Neji Hyuga. With that, he grasped the end of the blade and twisted until a sickening crack rang throughout the arena. The crowd gasped in horror, some civilians even vomiting. The participants were all shocked silent at the show of brutality. Hinata was on the verge of tears, while Hiyashi bowed his head in a moment of silence, all while covering Hanabi's eyes from the moment Naruto charged at his nephew. Gaara grinned, happy that someone had actually died in the exams, all while Hidan mirrored his smile in the crowd, offering thanks to his goddess for showing her harbinger the true way. Hiruzen was shocked at the sight of Naruto killing for the first time. Kira watched with interest and Rasa nodded slightly in approval. Jiraiya was worried. He had seen Naruto pause before Neji began speaking, almost like he was listening to a voice urging him on. Had the seal been damaged? Was the Kyuubi influencing his godson? On the rooftop, Sai sat there emotionless as always. Through the link with the crystal ball, Danzo allowed himself a small smile. That's my boy Naruto, he mused. That's my boy. Naruto ripped the blade free, kicking the corpse in the head, knocking the forehead protector off Neji's forehead. The caged bird seal shone on his forehead, for all to see before fading away forever. Naruto turned and began to walk away, an emotionless mask once more on his face as he strode towards the exit to rejoin his fellow participants. He barely even heard Genma proclaiming his verdict. Winner by death. Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto cared little. All he really heard was the voice in his head, congratulating him. Well done Naruto-kun, Sauron told her host. Well done. Soon, all will fear you, and rejoice. The crowd was still in a state of shock even as the medical team that had been standing by in case of this situation occurring was transporting Neji's body out of the arena. Members of the Hyuga clan were silently mourning the loss of one of their strongest prodigies, with even members of the main house bowing their heads in respect for the fallen branch member. Hinata was currently sobbing into her father's sleeve, even more shocked than the rest of the crowd at her cousin's brutal execution and the fact that it had come at the hands of the one that she admired and loved. Hiyashi sat in stoic silence, an arm around his second daughter who had finally figured out that Neji had not lived through his battle and was sitting silently while fighting back tears. Naruto returned to the viewing balcony and stood amongst the rest of the finalists and began idly cleaning his dagger-like sword with a cloth that he had pulled from within his robes, ignoring the looks he was getting from the finalists from the Leaf, as well as the remaining rookies that were watching with them. The finalists from the Sand Village however seemed to have different reactions to Neji's execution than those of the Leaf. Gaara had an insane bloodthirsty grin on his face, his irises contracting in such a way that made him seem even more unstable than before. Kankuro had a smirk on his face, though the faint drippings of sweat down his brow denoted that he himself was a little unnerved by the display. Either that or his catsuit was not suited for today's weather. Tamari had a clear look of disgust in her eye, but seemed otherwise unfazed for the most part. The rookies however, it was clear that they still hadn't processed that the dead last was able to brutally murder the previous Rookie of the Year in cold blood. Once Neji's body had been removed from the field and the ground had cleaned of the blood that remained, Genma glanced around to see if the crowd had calmed down somewhat. They hadn't really calmed down yet, but he pushed on nonetheless. Will Sasuke Uchiha and Sabaku no Gaara please come down to the arena? Gaara instantly reappeared in a swirl of sand to the right of the proctor, but there was no sign of Sasuke anywhere. Ino glanced around before turning to Sakura. Where the heck is Sasuke? He wouldn't miss his match, would he? Maybe he's just getting some last-minute training in? Sakura replied. Then a sudden thought occurred and she slumped slightly. Or he's taken after Kakashi-sensei and is trying to be fashionably late to everything now. He better not be late, Naruto remarked. I still want to fight him in the event that he wins. I refuse to fight a coward that doesn't bother to show up to a fight. Sakura fought the urge to glare at Naruto for insinuating that Sasuke was a coward. While she would have loved to yell at him to prove him wrong, she did just see him slaughter the prodigy of the Hyuga. Compared to that, she stood no chance against him at this point, so she wisely stayed silent. I repeat, will Sasuke Uchiha please come down to the arena, or he will forfeit his match. Genma called out once more. By now the crowd was beginning to get restless, wondering aloud to one another where the last Uchiha might be. Gaara was getting obviously frustrated with this turn of events, having wanted to fight the Uchiha on the basis that he was strong, and thus would prove his existence long enough for him to face off against the blonde in the robes. He didn't want to win by a default, for where was the fun in that? Very well, since Sasuke Uchiha has not come down to the arena, the winner by forfeit is. Genma was interrupted when an Anbu agent appeared next to him and whispered in his ear. The proctor looked clearly annoyed, but nodded nonetheless, turning back to the crowd and the increasingly irritable Jinchuriki. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be giving Sasuke Uchiha another 10 minutes to get to this arena. If he isn't here by the end of that time period, he will be disqualified. Sakura breathed a sigh of relief at those words before praying silently that Sasuke would get to the arena in time. Ino shared this look of relief as well. The rest of the rookies however, including the Sand Genin who were in the finals, didn't share this sentiment. Why the hell does Sasuke get special treatment again? Kiba yelled. I'm calling serious bullshit, this is so not fair. Normally I would not agree with you in such a thing Kiba, but in this case I am. This is indeed annoying, Shino replied, a faint tone of irritation in his stoic voice. What a drag, Shikamaru groaned. I can seriously bet that if that was anyone else, they'd have been disqualified 5 minutes ago. He sighed before uttering his other signature phrase. Troublesome. What's so special about that punk anyways? Kankuro asked. I mean seriously, Does this village wait on him hand and foot or something? This is ridiculous. Tamari nodded at her brother. If the exams had been hosted in sand, I can definitely say he'd be kicked out for even thinking of pulling a stunt like this. Naruto said nothing, merely standing impassively at the balcony looking over the arena. But on the inside, he was definitely fuming. Never thought I'd agree with Kiba of all people on this, but what the hell, he mentally ranted. Why is it that this village is so intent on giving Sasuke whatever he wants whenever he wants it? Isn't it obvious? Sauron crooned from within. He'll always be their shining star, their prize prodigy, groomed for the purpose of taking revenge on his brother and rebuilding the Uchiha clan, thus providing the village with a new batch of loyal Sharingan users. She paused for a moment before speaking once more. Actually, that's quite a sound plan, to be honest, despite the gaping hole in it that could cause the Uchiha clan to become even more conceited and dependent on the village due to Sasuke being handed everything he wants. I get that, but it's seriously annoying. Like Shikamaru said, if anyone else was late they'd be disqualified. Hell, if I was late I'm pretty sure I'd be not only disqualified but banned from taking the exams for a while. That's just the way they are, Naruto. They'll continue to scorn you, and those who say they're on your side may not be there forever. Danzo and Orika will. That I can be certain of. They might, that's true, Sauron admitted. But your so-called allies and friends in the Genin force, who's to say they'll be at your side? If they learn that you contain me, the Kyuubi no Kitsune, they'll discard you just like the rest of this village's inhabitants. Trust me, I know these things. Naruto shook his head for a moment. Regardless, their precious Uchiha will always be their knight in shining armor, while you're just the obstacle in their way. You shouldn't trust them. Don't ask for their acknowledgement, don't ask for their appreciation. Look around you, Naruto. What do you see on their faces when they look at you right now? Naruto glanced around the arena, taking in the sight of the civilians in the crowd, especially the emotions on their face when they looked his way. Fear. Yes, Naruto, fear. How does it feel, knowing that they fear you as such? It feels good. I feel satisfied. Yes, now you see it, don't you, Naruto? Fear is the key, Sauron whispered. And when I'm through with you, all will fear you and rejoice, love you and despair. Nothing will stand in your way. Perhaps. Naruto shook himself out of his thoughts as Genma began speaking once more. As far as he could tell, there was no Sasuke in sight. The mere thought of it sparked fury in Naruto, his armored fist unconsciously clenching tighter. How dare Sasuke not show up, even with the amount of favoritism in this village allowing him a second chance to show up. For the last time, if Sasuke Uchiha does not come down to the arena, he will be disqualified. No one came down to the arena. Genma sighed and glanced up at the Hokage. The Sandaime met the proctor's gaze and nodded. It seems that despite the extra time, Sasuke Uchiha has not arrived. Therefore, the winner by disqualification is Sabaku. Immediately a swirl of leaves spun into existence within the arena, quickly fading to reveal Kakashi Hatake dressed in his usual attire, orange book in hand with Sasuke Uchiha at his side. Sasuke was dressed in a black one-piece with an Uchiha fan on the back, with bandages wrapped around his arms and belt-like straps over top of them. Sorry, are we late? Kakashi drawled lazily. Very much so, Genma growled. Your student was almost disqualified twice. Upon hearing those words, Sasuke's Sharingan activated as he swiftly spun to glare at Kakashi, who had the decency to look somewhat sheepish. Oops, you think? Sasuke snarled. You specifically told me that we wouldn't be late for my match despite your so-called last-minute training, yet I was almost disqualified because of you. Twice. Well, technically you're not disqualified yet, Kakashi replied, holding his hands up in surrender. Yeah, barely, Genma muttered. Sasuke groaned and slapped a bandaged palm against his forehead and ran it down his face. His Sharingan now deactivated, he turned his gaze to Genma. So am I still allowed to fight? By a slim margin, yes. But if you try and pull a stunt like that in the Jonin exam, you'll be demoted back to Genin before you can get a chance to even explain yourself, Genma replied. Kakashi opened his mouth to retort, only for Sasuke to hold up a hand to silence his sensei. Sensei, just shut up before you make me look even more like an idiot today than you already have. Kakashi sighed and vanished in a shunshin, reappearing in the observation deck with the rookies and finalists, as well as Might Guy wheeling in Lee on a wheelchair, the pair having only just arrived a moment before Kakashi and Sasuke's entrance. "I must say my rival, that was very reckless, even by your standards," Guy remarked, uncharacteristically serious. "You don't jeopardize your students' chances for promotion in favor of arriving in style. It doesn't work like that. You're one to talk about jeopardizing a student's chances," Kakashi retorted lazily. "With you teaching Lee the 8 gates and all. I did that so he could have a trump card in his arsenal despite being unable to use ninjutsu or genjutsu." "Hey!" Both Jonin froze and turned to face the one who yelled, surprised to see it being the robed blonde who now had a clear look of irritation on his face. "Have your little pissing contest somewhere else alright?" Naruto growled. "The fight's about to start, and I want to see what they're capable of so I can plan for fighting whoever wins." "Wait, you actually won, Naruto?" Kakashi asked, slightly surprised. "Where's Neji then? I didn't see him around anywhere." Naruto shook his head and turned back to the arena. Kakashi raised an eyebrow and turned to Guy, who was solemn once more. "What, was it something I said?" Guy's eyes narrowed at Kakashi. "Kakashi, I apparently see that you apparently have no faith in any of your students with the exception of the one down there, but that's beside the point," Guy said in a low voice. "The reason Neji isn't here is because he's dead. Naruto killed him during their match." The silver-haired Jonin's visible eye widened. He certainly hadn't trained Naruto during the month training period, and to his knowledge, no one else that he knew had trained him either. Did he use the curse mark or the power of his burden? No, just swordsmanship, hand-to-hand combat, and the usage of some strange green chakra that took the form of flames. Kakashi was perplexed. If Naruto hadn't relied on the Kyuubi's power or that of the curse mark, then he must have been trained by someone to get strong enough to kill a genin of Neji's caliber. But the question was, who trained him? Not for the first time, Kakashi wondered if Hiruzen's suspicions about Danzo having a hand in Naruto's growth had a grain of truth to them. Either unaware or uncaring of what his squad leader was currently thinking, Naruto focused on the arena below him. Sasuke had settled in a taijutsu stance with his arms crossed in front of his upper chest and lower face, his fingers clawing inward towards his face. Gaara simply crossed his arms and stood impassively, the cork rocketing into the air as a small amount of sand began float into the air. Naruto's irises flashed black with twin red tomo for a brief moment before returning back to icy blue. He raised an eyebrow at the latent chakra laced throughout the sand, as well as the familiar chakra within Gaara's body. "Lady Sauron, that chakra is that of a Biju, correct?" "You would be correct, Naruto," Sauron replied. "That is the chakra of the Ichibi no Tanuki, Shukaku. While considered the weakest of the other Biju, he is still a force to be reckoned with due to his sand manipulation. Be wary of the fact that he has always been a bloodthirsty one, even for Biju standards, so don't be surprised that his host has been overtaken with madness." "I see." Gaara began to grip his forehead with his hand, muttering pleas under his breath, soft-spoken pleas to a mother, as he begged her to forgive him for something. Naruto's eyes narrowed at the sight, glancing at Kakashi. "Kakashi, Gaara is a Jinchuriki, correct?" "As far as we can tell, yes," Kakashi replied softly. "Why, then it is his Biju that he is communicating with?" Kakashi remained silent, gazing down at the unstable Jinchuriki down in the arena. At this point sand had begun to pool out of the gourd and writhe into ominous tendrils from the ground. The redhead was chuckling darkly as the sand began to morph into larger tendrils. "Most likely." Naruto turned back to the arena, proceeding to watch with newfound interest. The silver-haired Jonin eyed Naruto for a moment before focusing back on the approaching match. The two shinobi stood across from one another, still frozen motionless in their respective stances. Genma looked between the two of them and raised his hand before bringing it down in a swift chop, vacating the arena as he did. Sasuke quickly leapt backwards to avoid the arm of sand that lashed out from behind Gaara's back, flinging a barrage of shuriken towards the sand nin. Just as expected, a shield of sand reflexively appeared to catch the metal stars, Gaara standing there without moving a muscle. Sasuke raised an eyebrow before crouching back in his stance. "Seems that shield is as quick as ever," he muttered. "Let's hope this training paid off." The last Uchiha activated his Sharingan and shot forward with surprising speed, lashing out with a kick that was blocked by the sand shield. Quickly rolling aside before the sand was able to grasp his leg, Sasuke stood and held his hands in a seal. Kaden. Gukakyu no Jutsu. A large fireball rocketed from Sasuke's mouth, barreling straight for Gaara. The redhead scoffed as his shield of sand reformed in front of his body, right as the fireball impacted against it. Sasuke smirked, right as Gaara's eyes narrowed. As the smoke cleared, the sand shield had been permanently frozen in a solid wave of glass. Sasuke grinned as Gaara's frown deepened further than it already was. "You actually managed to turn my sand to glass," Gaara growled. "Indeed," Sasuke replied. "Now that your sand is out of the way, this should leave you wide open." Sasuke shot forward in a spinning roundhouse kick that slammed into Gaara's head and sent the other genin flying into the wall. Rock Lee noticed the move that Sasuke used, and a look of outrage appeared on his face. "He stole my move again." Guy turned to Kakashi, ready to launch into a tirade against his rival for allowing Sasuke to copy a comrade's technique when he heard a scoff from Naruto. "Your move?" Naruto remarked, removing his armored hand from the railing of the balcony. "If I remember correctly, the Konoha Senpu, Leaf Whirlwind, is not a taijutsu move unique to you and Might Guy alone. It is in fact a rather common technique that anyone with some degree of skill in taijutsu can learn. So therefore, while Sasuke may have used his Sharingan to copy it from you at some point, that does not make it your move. It's like if he managed to copy the Suiryuden no Jutsu, Water Dragon technique, during our mission to Wave. It's a common enough move that it wouldn't have been labeled as Zabuza's move." The rookies stood in silence, still having a bit of trouble connecting this current Naruto to the one they knew from before. Not only was he using sound logic in his argument, but he was actually defending Sasuke, if only by association. "Oh look, he survived." They all turned their attention back to the fight just in time to see that Gaara was crumpled against the wall, his skin cracking apart and turning brown, only it was not armor that had cracked off like before. The face cracked off to reveal a hollow shell of sand in the form of the Ichibi Jinchuriki, said shell quickly shattering back into the sand from whence it came as the ground beside the glass structure turned to sand. Gaara chuckled darkly for a moment as he rose up from the sand and stood beside the structure, composing himself back into a calm demeanor. "Not bad, Uchiha," Gaara remarked in a monotone. "Turning my sand to glass and attacking instantly afterwards was a solid plan. However, you incorrectly assumed that the sand comprising my shield was all of the sand in my gourd." As he spoke, the sand that comprised the shell floated into the air and returned to said gourd, as well as the sand on the ground from where Gaara emerged. Sasuke watched the movements of the sand warily, stepping back into his previous stance. Gaara uncrossed his arms as the final grains flew into his gourd, before stretching out his hand. Immediately sand erupted from the earth and formed into 3 obelisk-shaped formations in a wide circle around the sand genin. Gaara quickly stretched out his other hand and clenched them both into fists. Sand shot out of the structures in the shape of clawed hands marked with blue veins, lashing out at the Uchiha heir. Sasuke frowned and activated his Sharingan and begun using his rather impressive speed and agility to dodge the rocketing towards him. Naruto watched carefully, noting his teammate's current skill level. "He's been training hard, it seems." "Impressive speed, I suppose, for a worthless mortal," Sauron replied. "It will not save him though. Unless he has something that can punch through both Gaara's defense and current attack strategy," Naruto thought back. "You would be correct. He won't win this fight. But knowing Sasuke and the fact that Kakashi taught him, he might have a trump card and is just waiting for the best moment to show off the strength of the Uchiha." Naruto received naught but a chuckle from the Lady of Mordor, as he focused back on the fight. Sasuke was continuing to flip out of the way of the incoming sand arms, now interposed with sharpened tendrils that attempted to spear him whenever he dodged a claw. All the while Gaara stood impassively, occasionally gesturing with his hands to direct the sand towards their target. The black-haired genin narrowed his crimson eyes, Sharingan darting from side to side before leaping out of the way of another barrage of clawed hands. Sasuke swiftly flung a pair of kunai towards Gaara with a flick of his wrists. Gaara sighed in boredom as the sand shield instinctively caught the kunai in midair, only for his eyes to narrow as the handles of the knives began smoking. Seconds later the explosive tags wrapped around the kunai detonated, exploding right in Gaara's face. As the smoke cleared, the sand had separated but was quickly reforming. Gaara's face was set carefully yet still showed a bit of shock. Another surprising tactic, he mused. Immediately Sasuke flipped through his hand signs and settled on a single one before inhaling deeply. Kaden. Ryuka no Jutsu. Fire style. Dragon fire technique. Sasuke threw his head forward and expelled a massive burst of flames from his mouth in the form of a concentrated spray of fire in place of a single fireball. The flames quickly surged towards the pillars of solid sand, engulfing them in fire and coating the arena in smoke once more. Sasuke quickly leapt out of the dark cloud and allowed himself a cocky smirk. "Try dealing with that," he whispered. His arrogant smirk quickly faded when he heard the next set of words that Gaara called out. Futon. Daitopa. A relatively widespread but low-powered gust of wind blasted from Gaara's mouth, clearing away the smoke to reveal that the sand genin was still relatively unharmed, save for a few streaks of soot on his clothes. His sand obelisks however had been solidified into glass like the sand shield before them. Gaara's eyes flicked from side to side, taking in the gleaming glass structures before focusing back on the Uchiha. "I suppose you believe you have achieved something, haven't you?" Sasuke raised an eyebrow, crouching slightly in response to those words. Gaara's eyes narrowed as he continued speaking. "You must think yourself so clever to have turned my sand to glass so that I cannot use it, don't you?" he remarked. "You think that this proves your strength over me, due to the fact that you so cleverly deprived me of my sand. But you would be wrong." Gaara raised his hand in the air, his palm facing towards his opponent. "And in all honesty, against another opponent, that might have worked," he admitted. "But I'm not most opponents." With those words, Gaara clenched his hand into a fist. The glass sculptures instantly shattered into fine fragments, almost resembling the sand that it had once been. The semi-transparent sand quickly formed into a tendril that coiled around Gaara as he unclenched his fist, a mad gleam in his eyes. Sasuke's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the new sand surrounding Gaara. The Suna Genin crossed his arms and grinned. "Unfortunately for you, I deliberately let you solidify my sand into glass," Gaara remarked, much to Sasuke's horror. "After all, this is an exhibition of our abilities to see if we are worthy to be promoted to Chunin. You really didn't think I would come here without a few tricks up my sleeve?" With a gesture of his hand, Gaara sent the glass sand rocketing right at Sasuke. Sasuke quickly backflipped over the sand, a small portion grazing his right shoulder. To the shock of the crowd and those watching in the balcony, Sasuke yelled in pain and leapt further away, gripping his shoulder as blood began seeping through his fingers and staining his bandages. The cage were watching with interest, each featuring differing levels of shock and in some cases worry. The Sandaime looked clearly worried for Sasuke at this point, as the boy was not only facing a Jinchuriki, but one who could apparently turn anything into sand and manipulate it somehow. Kira the Otokage was watching with a smile on her face, clearly interested in the battle taking place below them. And Rasa? Rasa was shocked that Gaara had somehow managed to find a way to continue to manipulate his sand even if it had been turned to glass. The auburn-haired man idly fingered the small gourd on his belt that contained his signature gold dust, an odd feeling of pride welling up in him. "Lord Casecage," Hiruzen remarked. "Did you know your son could do that?" "No, I was unaware of this new advancement in Gaara's powers," Rasa admitted. "To think that he kept it secret from me and seems so proficient in wielding it is quite astounding." "And terrifying," Jiraiya said from his corner. His sand manipulation was scary before, but now that the sand can cut? The kid's gotten a whole lot more dangerous now. "Yes," Rasa replied. "Gaara truly is one of our most valuable shinobi." "I agree," Kira said in response, her honey-colored eyes still focused on the match. "However, I'm afraid that Gaara's glass sand might not be as perfected as you believe it to be, Lord Casecage." "What?" Rasa said in shock. Hiruzen and Jiraiya eyed the woman in surprise as Kira turned to them. "Aren't any of you able to sense chakra levels? If you were, you'd be able to tell quite easily what the greatest flaw of Gaara's technique would be." The other three shinobi stared at the Otokage in confusion before turning back to watch the match. "Is that blood?" Sakura yelled frantically. "Looks like it," Kankuro replied. "Now is when things get really crazy." "What the hell do you mean by that?" Ino screamed at the puppeteer. Kankuro winced and rubbed where his ears would be under his hood. Tamari shook her head and glanced back at the two Konoha kunoichi. The reason Kankuro is saying that is because your boy toy down there is screwed. The two girls looked ready to explode, their faces turning red as they prepared to launch into a tirade against the older girl who apparently had no faith in Sasuke's abilities. She may be correct, Naruto mused. Gaara does seem to be getting a little excited down there. He quickly turned to Kankuro and Tamari and raised an eyebrow. Does he have a blood fetish? He asked with a straight face. What? No, Gaara doesn't have a blood fetish. Tamari angrily replied. That we know of. Kankuro muttered under his breath. I see, Naruto remarked. So then it's the Ichibi then, fueling his mental instability? The two members of the Sand siblings stared at the robed blonde in shock, not even sure how he knew in the first place that Gaara was a Jinchuriki. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he turned back to the fight. Seems I was correct then. Meanwhile in the arena, Sasuke was dodging to the best of his abilities, taking care to make sure that no more of the glass sand touched him. Already the cut on his shoulder had bled a decent amount and Sasuke had no intentions of allowing another hit to land. Every now and again as he dodged, Sasuke would hurl a couple shuriken or kunai at Gaara, occasionally having an explosive tag wrapped around the handle. Gaara merely kept batting them aside with his glass sand, usually creating a new crater if an explosive tag was attached, that Sasuke had to watch out for while dodging. Gaara finally sighed and halted his hand gesturing, causing the glass sand to freeze in place and return to circle around his body. Sasuke watched the phenomenon warily, unsure of what was going to happen. I see it now, Sasuke Uchiha, Gaara remarked. You are not strong enough to fulfill my existence until I am able to fight the blonde one in the robes. Robes? Sasuke muttered, glancing up at the balcony. Immediately he noticed Naruto, cloaked in black robes and armor while looking down at the arena, an impassive expression on his face. For a brief second, Sasuke felt a small amount of anger rise up, only to begin hearing the whispers in the back of his mind. Whispers that he knew came from his curse mark. Shaking his head, Sasuke cleared his mind and focused away from the mark. He didn't need its dark power. Not now. Unfortunately, with this fact now realized, Gaara said as he raised his other hand. This means that I am going to kill you now. Gaara clapped his hands together and channeled his chakra. Sasuke quickly noticed the glass sand moving behind Gaara, so he swiftly activated his Sharingan. The glass sand quickly expanded in volume and then exploded from behind Gaara in the form of a massive wave at the sound of his words. Garasu Suna Takanami. Glass sand tidal wave. The tidal wave of translucent sand lashed out as Sasuke quickly began backflipping to avoid Gaara's attack. Yet while he moved, tendrils and spikes of glass fragments speared out from the wave in an attempt to catch him off guard, occasionally firing from the ground where the wave had crested before rising again to follow him once more. Naruto watched with great interest as Gaara covered the entire arena floor with glass sand, Sauron also observing from within Naruto's body with a smirk on her face. As the sand continued to expand outward, Sasuke leapt up the wall and crouched on it. Applying a layer of chakra from his feet, Sasuke stood horizontally as he gazed down at the layer of glass fragments covering the ground. This just got a lot trickier, Sasuke thought to himself. Are you just going to hide on the wall like a coward? Gaara called out, the glass sand writhing slightly. Just because you're up there doesn't mean I can't hit you with my sand if I want to. Kakashi stared at his student carefully with his visible eye, pondering what Sasuke might do next. Was he going to use the technique that he taught him during the month-long training period? Or was he going to wait and use it at another time? Sasuke pondered what to do, weighing in his options before finally making a decision. Crouching back on the wall, his Sharingan flared as he flipped through his hand seals before grasping his left wrist with his hand and holding his hand towards the wall. Kakashi smirked behind his mask as he saw what Sasuke was doing. So you're going to use it then, Sasuke? Kakashi, you didn't teach Sasuke that move. Guy yelled in alarm. He needed it in order to beat Gaara, so it was only logical that I teach it to him, Kakashi replied. That's beside the point, Kakashi. You don't go and teach a genin, especially one with some mental instability and a curse mark the Chidori for Kami's sake. Naruto's eyes narrowed upon hearing Guy's exclamation. The Chidori? Isn't that the move that Kakashi used back in the Wave mission? Either that or it's a slightly weaker version of that move, Sauron replied, shaking her head within the throne she was lounging on in the mindscape. Either way, yet another example of favoritism from your so-called sensei if he's willing to teach one of his prized techniques to only one of his students. Naruto said nothing in response. Meanwhile, bluish-white lightning began generating from Sasuke's palm, echoing with a sound of birds chirping throughout the entire arena. Gaara noted the amount of lightning and narrowed his eyes, recalling a decent amount of his sand to surround him. Sasuke roared and began charging down the wall, the lightning trailing from his hand and leaving a trench carved in the stone. Gaara quickly gestured with his hand and sent a flurry of tendrils from the glass sand. His eyes narrowed as the sand quickly solidified once more into solid glass, though notably in the rough shape of lightning bolts this time, due to the ambient electricity generated from Sasuke's technique. His mind made up, Gaara swiftly dropped the remainder of the glass sand hurtling towards Sasuke and crossed his arms in an X shape over his chest. The glass sand surrounding him rose and morphed into a spherical shield around the Tsunagenin, still somewhat translucent but not enough to see Gaara within. Sasuke continued his straightforward path, his lightning-charged palm now held out to the side as he rushed towards the glass shield. Right as he reached the sphere, he thrust his hand forward in a spearing motion. Chidori! The lightning-coated hand passed through the glass and hit its mark. Nobody said anything, still shocked at what was occurring below them. He did it! Sakura cheered happily, Ino cheering alongside her. Naruto scoffed, gaining the attention of not only the two kunoichi but also the rest of the occupants on the balcony. It's not over yet. Right as he finished speaking those words, a blood-curdling scream echoed from within the glass sphere as Sasuke screamed in pain. Gritting his teeth, the Uchiha heir generated another Chidori and cut himself free, removing his arm as spikes erupted from the sphere. Sasuke gripped his left arm and fought the urge to scream once more as he, in the crowd, beheld the gashes and cuts littering the limb, blood pouring out onto the ground. With another bellow of rage, the glass sphere exploded back into glass sand as Gaara re-emerged, looking furious while gripping the bleeding wound on his shoulder. Removing his blood-stained hand, he made a clawing motion in the direction of Sasuke, the glass sand moving to obey his command. Sasuke looked at his arm, then at the enraged Jinchuriki, then at the incoming wave of glass. He then came to a conclusion that he didn't like to admit, but he had no choice. I forfeit. He quickly rolled out of the way of the glass sand, grimacing as he did, right as the proctor stepped in front of him. Winner by forfeit. Sabaku no Gaara. Gaara breathed in deeply and slowly calmed down, the glass sand returning to his side as he returned the cork to his gourd of regular sand. Removing a small scroll with a seal on the side, Gaara directed the glass sand into the scroll and rolled it back up. Slipping it into one of the pouches on his belt, Gaara walked towards the exit as a trio of medics ran onto the field to tend to the wounded Uchiha. The red-headed genin sighed wearily as he climbed the stairs and sat down on a chair in the balcony, falling still as he sat and waited for the next chance he would get to fight. You see the problem with his technique? Kira remarked. You can definitely see it if you look at him now. I believe I do, Rasa said. While more powerful than his normal sand in terms of cutting power, the glass sand takes more chakra in order to manipulate it. Regardless, it is still a devastating technique, Hiruzen replied. If Gaara were to catch a target off guard with the glass sand, he'd be able to eliminate them quickly and thus avoid the chakra drain. I suppose so, Rasa remarked. Despite this, for him to have created such a technique on his own, I must commend my son. Yes, it is impressive, Hiruzen said in response. However, given his current level of bloodthirstiness, I'm not sure if he should be promoted yet. Unfortunately, I must agree with the Hokage on this, Kira said, glancing at Rasa. The man sighed before nodding. I must agree as well. Strong as he may be, Gaara isn't fully stable yet. Until that day comes, he will not be promoted. The other two Kage nodded, Jiraiya simply pondering their conversation from his place in the box. The rookies stood in shock, their minds not comprehending the fact that Sasuke had actually forfeited his match. For someone like Sasuke to give up, it was inconceivable in their eyes. Naruto meanwhile was giving a grudging nod of respect to the Uchiha. I'll admit, I'm surprised he actually realized that he was unable to defeat Gaara, he remarked. I would have expected him to continue fighting on the belief that he could win simply because he was an Uchiha. You know Naruto. Sasuke isn't that arrogant to think that a name alone will get him through his trials, Kakashi said, a faint admonishing tone in his voice. And you shouldn't say things like that about your teammates. Well, pardon me for not seeing any of that in all the time we've been teammates, Naruto replied. All I saw was the usual, I don't need teammates, they'll only get in my way, spiel he gave us on the day of the bell test. Kakashi didn't bother to reply, having instead begun to move towards the stairs, most likely to go check on his student. Naruto shook his head at the sight. And he wonders why I don't consider him my teacher, he muttered to himself. Once more a faint musical chuckle was heard from the back of his mind, Sauron apparently finding the situation humorous. Kakashi walked into the medical bay and strode over to where Sasuke was currently sitting with his shirt off, with one of the med nins currently holding a small pair of tweezers and was extracting small shards of Gaara's glass sand from his arm. The Uchiha glanced at Kakashi before focusing on the ground once more, occasionally wincing when a shard was removed. The silver-haired Jonin glanced around the room awkwardly, seemingly trying not to focus on Sasuke. Or the body lying under a sheet on the table across the room. So Sasuke, sensei, Sasuke said lowly. Right now I'm having fragments of glass sand removed from my arm, and I'm in quite a lot of pain. My arm feels like shit, and my pride has been shattered. I'm not in the mood to talk right now. Kakashi froze for a moment before opening his mouth, only to stop as Sasuke held up his uninjured arm. And if you offer to leave me any reading material while I'm going through this, I swear to Kami I will Chidori your book into oblivion. With that, Sasuke fell silent again as the med nin reached for another fragment with her tweezers. Kakashi still standing there not saying anything, all while desperately trying not to look at Neji's corpse. I can't believe that the puppet user quit before his match, after all that trash talking of his, Kiba remarked. Indeed, Shino replied, though I'm not sure whether or not this is fortunate for myself. Why not? Sakura asked. You get a free pass to the semifinals, so that's good, right? Perhaps, but that would mean I have to battle the Suna girl currently attempting to give Shikamaru brain damage with that fan of hers, Shino said, gesturing towards the field. Kiba winced as a particularly harsh blow struck Shikamaru across the head. I see your point, man, he muttered. Not only that, but should I win against her and make it to the finals, Shino said lowly, a faint tone of worry in his voice. I'd have to fight someone I cannot hope to win. Which do you think would be more trouble, Shino? Naruto or Gaara? Ino asked. Between a sand user who can kill you with a simple hand gesture and all of the earth around you, to a blonde enigma who uses unknown techniques and brutally slaughtered his own comrade. Shino paused as a small drop of sweat ran down his forehead. I'm still weighing my options. Yeah, Sakura replied, stifling a small shiver. I really wouldn't want to fight Naruto as he is now. Before, he was just a lovable idiot who gave it his all, and now. She glanced to Naruto, who made no motion to acknowledge that he had even heard what she said. A blank look was in his eye, and while he appeared to be watching the fight, Sakura believed that Naruto didn't seem all there, to be honest. I have no idea what to describe him as now. So what exactly do you plan to do for battling Gaara? Sauron asked from where she lounged on her throne. Use the information at your disposal thus far to come up with a strategy for use against him. Naruto paced in front of the faintly shimmering barrier separating him from his tenant, an armored hand on his chin as he began running through various scenarios in his head. From what we saw in his match with Sasuke, Gaara doesn't use the glass sand exclusively, but will not hesitate to capitalize on an opponent crystallizing his sand into glass, Naruto said thoughtfully. He will even allow them to form glass from his sand for the purpose of crushing it into small fragments and using it in battle. Regardless, his manipulation of both regular and glass sand is unparalleled by anyone else we've seen. To be fair, there aren't many sand users that we've seen. Continue. However, there are downsides to his techniques, Naruto remarked. His sand shield can be broken with enough blunt force, as shown in his battle with Rock Lee. His sand armor is quite strong, but riddled with weak points and consumes large amounts of chakra, even for Jinchuriki. And while his glass sand has the advantage of cutting power in addition to crushing force, it too seems to take more chakra to manipulate, though not as much as sustaining the armor. Correct, Sauron replied. So what do you intend to do about it? If I can continue to evade his attacks either by agility or by my shadow technique, I might be able to catch him off guard with a pulse of spiritual energy to stun him before hitting him continuously with a flurry of attacks. Sauron sighed and shook her head. While that may work, I don't believe you should focus on such a straightforward plan. Integrate that tactic with your final strategy, but don't make it the focal point of taking him down, Sauron said, standing from her throne and walking down towards the barrier. If at all possible, it may be best to avoid using some of your other Wraith abilities at this point to not attract more attention to yourself. Naruto groaned and walked to the barrier to stand across from Sauron. Then what would you have me do? Gaara might be able to counter my flail after seeing it in battle against Neji, and I don't want to glass his sand with the soulfire. Sauron threw back her head and burst into laughter, her vermilion eyes flashing orange as her amusement grew. Naruto narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. How naive you are, my champion, Sauron remarked once her laughter ceased. Did you happen to forget that soulfire does not act like traditional flames in that it doesn't burn like you would think it to? The blonde froze and looked up, thinking back to his training with Sauron. A sheepish grin formed on his face as he put a hand on the back of his head. Oh, right indeed, Sauron replied, an amused smirk on her face. But that's not the only trick in your arsenal, right Naruto? Surely you must have something else that could combat Gaara's sand? Naruto thought for a moment before grinning. Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, Sauron purred, her eyes flashing golden for the briefest of moments. You have a plan of action now? I do indeed, Naruto replied. Good, then tell me of your current plan. Naruto refocused on the world around him as he exited the mindscape. Shaking his head, he glanced down at the field to see Shikamaru still dodging the wind blasts of the fan-wielding Tsunagenin. Odd, Naruto mused. I would have expected him to forfeit a while ago. You wouldn't be the first. Naruto turned to see his male teammate walking over towards him, his injured arm wrapped in bandages and hanging in a sling while his opposite shoulder was wrapped as well. A couple of small adhesive patches were attached to his face, and while Sasuke showed some discomfort he seemed relatively unfazed. The blonde eyed the arm before looking back at Sasuke's face. I trust they patched you up sufficiently? Yes, Sasuke muttered lowly, still quite irritated. Still wish I didn't have to forfeit my match though. You could have continued the fight if you wished to, Naruto remarked. And risk dying or crippling myself to the point of ending my shinobi career? Sasuke retorted angrily, his Sharingan briefly flaring. No thanks. I'd like to remain alive and intact so I can see the life leave Itachi's eyes when I get my revenge. Naruto shrugged. I suppose so. The two stood in silence for a few moments, seemingly watching the battle below them. Sasuke glanced at his teammate, his eyes focusing on the similar mark to his own on Naruto's neck, said mark currently showing partially from Naruto's robes. Why didn't you tell me that you were given one of those too? Didn't see the point, Naruto replied. What difference would it have made? You could have gotten it sealed up earlier if you let someone know. Naruto said nothing as he turned away from his teammate, shifting his robes slightly to cover the shuriken-shaped mark on his neck. Sasuke watched the motion, idly rubbing his neck as his own mark pulsed slightly. He glanced back down at the arena, to see that Shikamaru had managed to trap Temari in his Kagemane no Jutsu, shadow possession technique, before doing something that was completely expected from anyone who knew the Nara clan. I give up. The outrage of the crowd didn't manage to fully drown out Shikamaru giving his reasons for forfeiting before quickly leaving to avoid getting another blow to the head from Temari's massive fan. Once the blonde girl had calmed down and left the arena, Genma looked up at the balcony. Would Sabaku no Gaara and Naruto Uzumaki please come down to the arena? Your match is about to begin. Naruto stretched idly and placed a hand on the hilt of his sword and prepared to move towards the arena when Sasuke grabbed his shoulder. Whatever you do Naruto, don't you dare lose to him, Sasuke growled. Naruto smirked. The thought never crossed my mind. With that, Sasuke removed his hand as Naruto disappeared in a swirl of shadow and reappeared beside the proctor right as Gaara appeared in a spiral of sand. Genma glanced at each genin carefully. Now while the rules may allow killing, he said, focusing on both competitors. I would prefer it if you do not win by ending the life of your opponent. If one of you appears to be going for a killing blow after you have clearly won, you will be restrained. Understood? Both genin gave a slight nod, the cork flying out of Gaara's gourd as Naruto unsheathed the blade of his sword by an inch with his thumb. Genma raised his hand and brought it down before vanishing in a shunshin. Gaara immediately went on the offensive, launching a wave of sand from his gourd. Naruto unsheathed his sword in response and slashed at the sand to deflect it before leaping back several feet to avoid an arm forming out of the sand. Landing in a crouch, Naruto placed his hand on the ground and closed his eyes. Flames ignited on the ground as Naruto lifted his hand, taking with him the hilt of a sword. Standing up as he lifted his hand, Naruto pulled a massive brass greatsword from the flames, the blade about as tall as he was with the blade being wider than the width of his arm. He took the enormous blade in hand and swung it experimentally before moving it towards his back, the sword fixating itself there despite the lack of a sheath. Naruto then took his first sword in his right hand and leveled the blade until it was lying horizontally while pointed at Gaara, his free hand lying parallel to the sword. Black ringed eyes narrowed at the sight of the massive blade on Naruto's back. Gaara gestured with his hand to cause the sand to form a tendril around him. He crossed his arms as small lumps began forming on the tendril, slowly increasing in size as he gazed at his opponent. Renden Suna Shigur. Successive shots sand drizzle. The lumps finished forming and quickly fired out like bullets, lancing through the air towards their blonde target. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he swiftly diffused each projectile with a precise slash of his sword. Raising the sword in front of him, Naruto focused as pale green energy formed along the blade with a shape reminiscent of flames. Gripping the blade with both hands, he lifted the sword into the air and brought it down, launching a projectile of the flame-like energy at Gaara. The sand quickly coiled around Gaara to block the energy blast, giving Naruto enough time to disappear in a spiral of shadow. Reappearing behind Gaara, Naruto flipped through his hand seals and inhaled deeply. Futon. Shinkagyoku. Wind style. Vacuum bullets. He swiftly exhaled, firing off a barrage of small spherical blasts of wind at his fellow Jinchuriki. Gaara quickly spun, his sand rising up to block the shots, only for the wind bullets to punch through the shield of sand. Gaara began to dodge to the best of his abilities, but as a shinobi focused mainly on stationary combat with the use of his sand, his mobility was not the best that it could be. As a result, a few of the bullets of wind were able to connect long enough to leave gashes on his arms and shoulder. The Ichibi Jinchuriki glared at the blood dripping from the wounds left behind before focusing back on Naruto, rage clear on his face. This was the second time that he had seen his blood today, and Gaara was clearly not happy about that. His robed opponent quickly slashed through the air with his sword, firing off another blast of energy before vanishing and reappearing a few feet from the left and launching another, finishing off by reappearing to Gaara's left and letting another projectile fly from his blade. The red-haired genin swiftly crossed his arms in an X in front of his chest, his sand instinctively coiling around his body to deflect the energy coming at him from several directions at once. The projectiles collided with his sand shield and exploded, dispersing the sand in multiple directions around the field. As Gaara shook his head and prepared to recall his sand, Naruto appeared directly behind him in a swirl of shadow with sword in hand. Naruto charged up his fist with pale blue energy before punching towards Gaara, a fist-sized projectile firing off and managing to connect with the Suna Genin. Gaara froze as pale energy pulsed over his body, growling angrily as he struggled to move. Naruto capitalized on this and leapt into the air and brought his sword down in a stabbing motion. Right as the blade was about to connect, a mad grin formed on Gaara's face as he raised his hand and clenched his fist. Immediately the sand shield reformed around the blade, stopping its downward path and holding it in place. Naruto swore and yanked on the sword, only for the weapon to stubbornly refuse to be moved from the grip of Gaara's sand. Gaara began chuckling darkly as he gestured with his free hand. Becoming aware of the sound of sand to his left, Naruto pulled as hard as he could on the blade before glancing over to see the clawed arm forming out of the sand and reaching towards him. His mind made up, Naruto gripped the pommel of the sword and vaulted over it, just barely leaping over the grasping fingers of the sand, and landed several feet away. Gaara grinned as the arm of sand removed the sword and held it up for Naruto and all the spectators to see. With an evil-sounding chuckle, Gaara clenched his fist, the arm of sand mimicking his movements and crushing the sword into small fragments of metal. As Gaara began laughing maniacally, Naruto stared at the shattered remains of his sword before looking back up at his opponent. "You broke my blade." A faint pale green light flashed in Naruto's eyes, nearly all of his teeth briefly extending into fangs before receding. His curse mark pulsed, then lay still, not activating like some of the Jonin watching the match thought it would have. Within Naruto's body and very soul, Sauron allowed herself a smirk, her crimson eyes flashing orange. She slowly raised a hand in the air and snapped her fingers. As this was happening, Naruto removed the massive brass greatsword from his back and held it in front of his body with both hands. Immediately the enormous blade ignited in flames that seemed to generate from the sword itself. Gaara looked over the blade and scoffed. "You didn't pay attention to the match with the Uchiha, did you? Fire won't help you here." Up on the balcony, Sasuke watched the fight carefully. While he had briefly activated his Sharingan at the start of the match, he promptly deactivated it upon noting that Naruto was not using any chakra in his sword attacks. He gazed at the flame-coated blade, not entirely sure what his teammate was planning. "I know you're not that much of an idiot to use a tactic you already know failed for me," he thought to himself. "So just what are you up to, Naruto?" Naruto lifted the greatsword higher as the flames appeared to intensify, before twisting the blade so the edge was facing Gaara. He reared the sword back behind his head and gripped it tightly before bringing it back in a forward arc towards Gaara. Unlike the energy projectiles launched before from his previous sword, this one was much larger and comprised of actual flames instead of energy in the shape of flames. It was also considerably faster despite its larger size, and the heat was like walking into an inferno. Gaara's eyes widened in shock as he swiftly formed a coating of sand armor before raising his shield. The wave of flame cleaved through the shield instantly, leaving Gaara defenseless. With barely enough time to think, Gaara dove to the side, his arm getting caught in the flames during the tail end of his leap. Landing to his left, the pain finally set in and Gaara let out a yell of agony. Naruto smirked as Gaara grimaced and gripped his injured arm, the sand armor coating it now blackened with what appeared to be molten cracks littering its surface. The last vestiges of fire flickered out on the greatsword, prompting Naruto to replace it on his back. Gaara grit his teeth and released his hold on the sand armor on his arm, allowing the now blackened sand to crack off and fall to the ground. Gaara's pants sleeve had been burnt off, and several burns marred the skin along his arm. Gaara snarled angrily as he gripped his injured arm, glancing up as Naruto began speaking. "What was that about flames being useless against you?" Naruto called out mockingly. Gaara's face contorted in rage as the earth beneath his feet broke down into sand and began to slide up his body towards the injured limb. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he swiftly knelt and placed a hand on the ground once more. Focusing his energy, he spoke yet again. "Congregate the light of the moon," he chanted softly. "Cast judgment upon these wicked souls, and smite them with your malevolent brilliance." Pale green flames ignited beneath his palm as he lifted himself from the ground, taking forth from the flames a sword of similar build to the sword Gaara had just broken. The main differences between this blade and the previous, however, was that the current one appeared to be better forged and was a sleeker design compared to the original. Naruto idly spun the sword in a circle in his hand before holding it in front of his body with both hands, the flat of the blade facing his opponent. Gaara meanwhile had stood up as the sand that coated his arm fell to the ground, revealing unblemished skin beneath it for a brief instant before his sand armor reformed over the limb. He flexed the fingers on that hand for a moment as he focused back on the robed blonde across from him. Narrowing his eyes, Gaara took note of the new sword in his opponent's hands. After the fiasco with that massive greatsword, he didn't want to take any chances against whatever tricks that new blade might have. Gesturing with his hand, Gaara launched a clawed arm of sand at his opponent. Naruto simply adjusted his grip on his weapon and continued to hold it in front of his body. Removing one hand from the hilt, Naruto placed his palm against the flat of the blade as the arm of sand shot towards him. The blade began to resonate with a light purple glow as Naruto replaced his hand on the hilt and tilted the sword so it pointed horizontally at the incoming projectile. Rearing back, Naruto lunged in a two-handed stab, impaling the arm of sand on the blade of his sword. With a twist of his wrist, Naruto slashed to the right, dispersing the arm before spinning and slashing the blade horizontally in the air, launching a crescent of lilac energy right at Gaara. Gaara swiftly crossed his arms in front of his body, forming a much thicker shield of sand a few feet in front of him. Upon seeing the energy projectile slicing through the shield of sand as if it wasn't even there, Gaara reacted quickly and spread his arms out to the side while increasing the thickness of the sand armor on his torso using the rest of the sand on his body. Naruto's projectile impacted with Gaara's chest before exploding and sending the Tsunagenin flying into the wall. Gaara slid down the wall and knelt for a moment before standing, the sand focused on his chest redistributing back to its previous form across his entire body. Naruto watched his opponent rise, idly flicking his sword to the side as the still present purple energy faded away from the blade. Gaara shook his head, hearing the whispers of "Mother" in the back of his mind, encouraging him and urging him to crush the interloper before them, drenching his sand with the blonde's blood. Calming himself somewhat, Gaara focused and closed his eyes as he felt the chakra of his tenant flow through him, focusing into the redhead's arms. You know, closing one's eyes in battle is the easiest way to get yourself killed. Gaara's eyes snapped open to see Naruto having appeared in front of him, sword raised as the blade began glowing with lilac energy. He swiped with his hand to form a shield of sand, only for Naruto to slash his sword across it, disrupting the shield and forcing the sand away. Gaara continued frantically gesturing with his hands, reforming shield after shield as Naruto continued cutting them down. As Gaara formed one last shield, Naruto batted it aside with his blade right before the glow faded. The Tsunagenin panted softly as he stood from his hunched position, while Naruto lifted his sword once more. It seems you cannot hold back my attacks any longer, Naruto remarked. How unfortunate. The robed blonde brought the blade down, only for Gaara to roll out of the way, his other sleeve getting caught by the blade and tearing off in the process. Gaara quickly stood and spread his arms out to his sides as dark blue markings reminiscent of Naruto and Sasuke's curse marks formed on his skin. Gaara clapped his hands together, instantly causing the sand spread across the ground to surge forward and converge on Naruto. He eyed the surrounding waves of sand, a grudging note of respect in his eyes. You let me blow apart your shields in order to spread the sand around the arena to use in a trap technique of some sorts, Naruto mused. You have quite the tactical mind, Sabaku no Gaara. The sand crested and slammed into the blonde Jinchuriki as Gaara held out his hands. The mound of sand quickly formed into the rough shape of a pyramid as Gaara slapped his hands onto the sand-covered ground. The serpentine markings on his arms shifted, moving from his skin onto the sand before enveloping the pyramid of sand and interlocking to form an intricate fuinjutsu. Gaara wiped the sweat from his brow before standing, a bloodthirsty grin on his face as he raised his open hand. To think that he had progressed far enough to utilize that in his arsenal, Rasa mused as he watched the fight below. Hiruzen raised his eyebrow before Jiraiya stepped forward. Gaara appears to have used fuinjutsu in order to seal Naruto away in that structure of sand, most likely so he can crush the structure and Naruto at the same time to win the match. But where did he get the fuinjutsu in the first place to use the technique? They appear to have originated from his arms, Kira replied. They formed on his skin before transferring onto the sand and interlocking once Naruto Uzumaki was trapped within. A clever strategy, even utilizing the sand dispersed from his shield to facilitate the beginning of the technique. Hiruzen looked down at the arena as Gaara began raising his hand. Jiraiya's eyes narrowed as he focused on the cage. Where did that seal actually come from? He asked. Rasa gazed at the sand, deep in thought, before looking back at the Gamma Sennin. I believe it came from the Shukaku. The Tanuki does have natural cursed seal markings on its body, so it's possible that Gaara managed to tap into enough of Shukaku's power in order to manifest the markings for use in this technique, Rasa replied. If that is the case, Naruto Uzumaki is finished. The Sandaime Hokage and Jiraiya swiftly looked to the arena, alarm clear on their faces, with concern being clearly evident in Hiruzen's eyes. Kira let out a soft chuckle, causing the other four occupants of the box to look at the Otokage in confusion. I wouldn't count him out just yet. He may still have a trick or two up those sleeves of his, she remarked with a small smile. Gaara chuckled darkly as he prepared to clench his hand into a fist. Sabaku so. A small plume of fire ignited from the top of the pyramid, causing Gaara to pause his movement in shock. The flame continued to grow in size before ripping down the side of the structure of sand facing away from Gaara and spiraling forward on the front side. The sand pyramid exploded in a rotating coil of flames, Naruto standing directly in the center of it with his massive brass sword removed from his back with flames ignited along the blade. The robed blonde stood and brushed sand off of his shoulders, gigantic sword still in hand, his other blade now sheathed at his side. Naruto tilted his head until a faint crack was heard from his neck before aligning himself to face Gaara. An impressive technique, of that there is no doubt, Naruto remarked. Had I been any other opponent, that might have succeeded. Unfortunately for you, I am not most opponents. Gaara's eyes widened as he heard his own words against the Uchiha repeat for him, his fingers twitching softly as his pupils dilated. Naruto stared impassively at his fellow Jinchuriki before sighing and stabbing the brass greatsword into the ground, the blade reigniting in flames once more. If that was the best you could do, then I'm afraid you've lost this battle. The flames emanating from the blade intensified, the ground where the point was stabbed beginning to melt around the metal. Tilting the sword diagonally from its impaled position on the ground, Naruto gripped the hilt tightly and ripped the blade free with an upward slash, unleashing a massive wave of fire that traveled along the ground towards Gaara. Gaara snapped out of his shock just in time to notice the fiery projectile rocketing towards him. With no time to dodge, Gaara swiftly sent almost all his sand armor to his torso once more and pumped a massive amount of chakra into it, even as the remainder of his sand coiled into a shield in front of him. The wave of fire ripped through the shield and slammed into Gaara, exploding and sending him flying into the wall once more. Naruto swung the massive sword to the side, the flames lingering on the blade dying out before he replaced it on his back. Reaching into his robe, Naruto unsheathed the dagger-like sword and slowly walked towards where Gaara currently lay. The red-haired Jinchuriki wasn't doing so good, his sand armor having not protected him completely from harm. The sand was blackened with molten cracks littering its surface, a large gash-like burn lashing askew across Gaara's torso. Blood dripped from the rent skin, the smell of charred flesh lingering in the air around him. Gaara's black-ringed eyes slowly opened and focused on the grievous wound that marred his body, seemingly unable to comprehend what his eyes were showing him. Gaara reached forward with a slightly shaking hand and gently placed his fingers on the wound, wincing in pain at the contact. Removing his hand, Gaara stared at the blood coating his fingers, his eyes widening at the sight. Blood? He asked himself, shock evident in his tone. Is this my blood? Naruto continued to walk slowly towards him, short blade in hand as he sighed and shook his head. You truly must be naive to not recognize your own blood, he remarked. Or perhaps you were never one to face true hardship in your life if that is your reaction to that wound. He stopped, standing a couple feet in front of the downed Jinchuriki, Gaara's eyes still blankly staring at the red staining his fingers and dripping onto his palm. Naruto pointed the blade at Gaara, who slowly focused on the weapon aimed at his head. Since we could be considered of the same breed of sacrifice, Naruto said calmly, and that I am feeling merciful for some odd reason, I will give you this one chance to surrender and keep your life. Gaara looked up at Naruto, his blank gaze instantly distorting into fury. You spilled my blood. The Ichibi Jinchuriki stood as best he could and threw a right hook at the robed blonde. Naruto sighed and lazily tilted his head to the side before grabbing the offending limb in his armored grip. Gripping the arm tightly, Naruto slammed it into the wall and proceeded to flip his dagger into a reversed grip and stab it through Gaara's hand and into the wall. Gaara's sensation of pain finally peaked, and the red-haired genin began screaming in agony. Naruto swiftly unsheathed the sword at his side and delivered a swift slash to Gaara's leg, forcing him down to his knees. Very well then, if that is your choice, then so be it. Death it is. Naruto reared back with his argent greatsword, preparing to impale Gaara through the chest even as Genma reappeared in the arena. Gaara's eyes closed for the briefest of moments, before snapping open. Gaara's eyes now sported black sclera and gleaming gold irises with a cross-shaped pupil, a new grin forming on his face. Whereas before Gaara's grin gleamed with bloodlust and a hint of madness, this grin was full-on psychotic and bloodthirsty. Gaara let out a series of insane high-pitched cackles as he clenched his free hand into a clawing motion. You really are a hopeless case, aren't you, Gaara? Naruto's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before a massive clawed arm of sand erupted from the ground and smacked him in the torso and sent him flying into the opposite wall. Gaara stood, still giggling maniacally as he ripped the dagger free from his hand. Flexing the fingers on the hand as the wound began to steam and slowly close up, Gaara lifted the blade and licked the blood from the weapon before tossing it aside. Naruto stood groggily, leaning on his sword to steady himself as Gaara burst into laughter once more. Seconds later, a steady stream of white feathers began to fall around the arena. Immediately the civilians and some of the genin slumped over and passed out, with the cage box exploding shortly after. Temari and Kankuro swiftly leapt into the arena and restrained Gaara while their sensei barked orders to them. The two siblings kept a tight grip on Gaara as they leapt from the stadium, their sensei leaping in another direction. Naruto shook his head for a moment before focusing on the fleeing trio of Suna genin, uncaring of the large amount of shinobi forces from the villages of Leaf, Sound, and Sand leaping around in the carnage of battle. "You really think you'll escape me?" he muttered, a faint gleam of green appearing in his eyes. He winced and placed a hand on his chest, removing it to take note of the blood now splattered on his gauntlet. Clenching his hand into a fist, Naruto grit his teeth as a faint aura of pale green became visible around his body, even as the wounds left by Gaara's sandclaw healed at a rapid pace. "No, you shall not escape from me," Naruto roared. "Indeed he won't." Naruto, Sauron whispered from within his mind. "And why should he? He managed to wound you, spill your blood. Find him, end him." As she spoke, Naruto's face contorted with fury, the aura around him flickering with red as it intensified in strength. Raising his sword high, Naruto let out an unearthly shriek of rage that immediately chilled the hearts of those around him, both enemy and ally alike. Even those in the cage box paused in their battle, freezing at the sound of that ungodly wail. His rage having peaked, Naruto swept his sword to his side and leapt from the ground and landed on the roof of the arena, pausing for the briefest of moments before rocketing off into the forests after the Sand siblings, a faint trail of energy of the palest green following behind him. Immediately at the sound of the insane cackling of the Shukaku, as well as the appearance of the white feathers in the air, Kira and Rasa shared a look and nodded before raising a single handseal each. Hiruzen and Jiraiya's eyes widened right as the explosion triggered. Out of the smoke cloud, 4 figures quickly leapt onto the rooftops, 2 of them covered in soot. Hiruzen glared at the 2 cages standing across from him. "I should have figured you'd plan something like this, Orika." The newly revealed Orika let out a devious giggle as she reached up to her face and tore it off, revealing her true features beneath it: snow-white skin, sickly golden eyes with a serpentine pupil, purple markings around her eyelids and jutting down towards her nose. Rasa merely flexed his hand as black markings formed around his own eyes, markings that immediately sparked an even stronger resemblance between him and his son. "Nothing ever seems to get past you, Sarutobi-sensei?" Orika drawled with a smirk, her canines elongating slightly into fangs. "Something tells me you suspected this all along." "Well, I immediately thought you were going to make a move of some sort," Sarutobi replied. "However, I will admit I did not anticipate your involvement in this Lord Cage." Rasa shifted slightly as his infamous gold dust began pooling out of the small gourd on his belt. "I tell you it's nothing personal, Lord Hokage," he remarked. "But if I did I would be lying. Given how much the Wind Daimyo has been sending missions away from Suna and to Konoha, our value as a shinobi village has been diminished by our own feudal lord. So with that in mind," Rasa raised his hands as the gold dust began to rise around him, forming into tendrils not unlike that of the sand his son manipulated. "What better way to re-establish our value as a shinobi village than to eliminate the one lowering our value?" Thrusting his hand forward, Rasa sent a swift wave of gold at the Sandaime Hokage. Hiruzen quickly leapt out of the way, right as Jiraiya landed beside him. The remaining loyal Sannin looked at the cage with narrowed eyes. "Funny thing is, he actually does have a point," the white-haired man remarked to Hiruzen. Hiruzen said nothing in response, merely removing his ceremonial robes to reveal his battle armor beneath them. Upon seeing her sensei's attire, Orika chuckled. "Feeling sentimental, sensei?" she said merrily. "I'm touched." Raising a hand, Orika snapped her fingers. As the sharp sound reverberated through the air, Four shinobi wearing brown garments and purple ropes tied around their waists as belts dropped onto the corner of the rooftop. "Do it," Orika called out. Nodding towards the leader of the Sound Village, the four shinobi formed a single handseal before clapping their hands together. Their chakra flared and quickly turned dark purple as black markings spread from their necks onto the sides of their faces. Shishienjin, four violet flames formation. As the name suggested, violet flames exploded from the four shinobi and quickly formed a rectangular barrier of purple fire, with each of the four standing at the corners of the technique. Sarutobi narrowed his eyes at the sight of the barrier before turning to his wayward student. "You don't want anyone to interfere, do you?" "Of course not," Orika admitted. "Strong independent woman I may be, but even I know my limits, however large and unreachable they are." Jiraiya chuckled as he settled into the taijutsu style the toads of his contract had taught him. "Still as arrogant as ever, Orika?" he asked wryly. "Still chasing anything with breasts and a skirt, Jiraiya?" Orika replied, a smirk on her face. The white-haired Sannin immediately adopted a look of mock sorrow as he placed a hand over his heart. "Oh, you wound me, Orika," he wailed dramatically. "You still think I am but a lowly pervert, do you not? Well, fear not, for I am not a pervert." Orika immediately realized what he was going to say, as well as Hiruzen, who made a move to stop his other student. "I am a super pervert," Jiraiya bellowed with a mad gleam in his eye. Hiruzen sighed and considered summoning Enma purely for the reason of having something to slam his head into. Meanwhile, a noticeable drop of sweat ran down the sides of everyone else's heads, from the four shinobi holding up the barrier to Orika and Rasa. The auburn-haired man slowly turned to his female companion. "Is he serious?" "Unfortunately," Orika replied in a low voice. "You'd think he'd grow out of it at his age, but in his case it seems that age merely empowered his perversion." Rasa paused for a moment. "I thought you two were the same age?" Seconds after that sentence left his mouth, Orika spun to face him so quickly that a faint crack was heard from her neck, immediately opening her mouth and extending the blade of the kusanagi to pass less than an inch from his skin. Rasa swiftly raised his hands in surrender, prompting Orika to retract the blade before regurgitating it fully into her hand. Spinning the sword for a second to remove the saliva from the blade, she turned back to the cage with a mad grin. "Never ask a lady her age, young man," she remarked softly. "Lest they try and kill you for it." Rasa turned away from her and focused back on the duo in front of them. "Joking aside," he remarked, "I'll deal with the proclaimed super pervert while you take on Sarutobi." "Fine," Orika muttered. "Just leave some for me to dissect later." Upon hearing those words, Jiraiya noticeably gulped. Rasa shook his head before gesturing towards the Sannin, a wave of gold dust surging towards him. As Jiraiya began dodging the sea of gold, Orika focused back on her sensei. "Well then, sensei, shall we dance?" Orika said gleefully, a gleam in her golden eyes. "Indeed we shall." Orika leapt at Hiruzen, kusanagi in hand, as she began attacking with a flurry of slashes. Despite his obvious advanced age, Hiruzen had little trouble dodging the blows of Orika's sword. Waiting for an opening, Hiruzen swiftly found his chance and caught Orika off guard with a kick to the stomach. As the snake-like woman was sent flying back a few feet, flipping in the air to land on her feet, Hiruzen flipped through his hand seals and inhaled a deep breath. Kaden. Karyu Enden. Fire style. Fire dragon flame bullet. Hiruzen threw his head forward and expelled a massive bullet of fire that quickly split into 3 projectiles in the shape of dragons. The fire dragons swiftly circled around and locked in on Orika from the front and sides, diving towards her with a roar in their maw. Orika merely grinned and impaled the kusanagi on the roof before flipping through her own hand signs. Doden. Doryuheki. Earth style. Earth style wall. A slab of earth emerged from the rooftop in front of Orika, right in the path of the flame dragons. The fiery projectiles quickly impacted against the wall and exploded, crumbling the wall yet not dealing any direct damage to Orika. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed as Orika's grin grew wider. She clapped her hands together and said 3 words that immediately ignited the chill of fear running down Hiruzen's spine. Kachiyose. Edo Tensai. Summoning. Impure world reincarnation. Hiruzen's blood ran cold as sweat began to bead along his brow, as 2 coffins rose from the ground beside Orika. Her fanged grin grew more malicious as the lids of the coffins slowly fell forward, revealing the contents inside. And while Hiruzen gazed upon the contents of the coffins in horror, the rooftop rang with Orika's gleefully maniacal laughter.
That's all for now. If you want to see next part, then please like this video and subscribe my channel. Thank you.